The Chinese woman stood in the dust outside the saloon, holding a crumpled newspaper advertisement for a wife, while every person on the street stared at her like she'd brought plague with her from across the ocean. The notice belonged to Ethan Crowe, the rancher nobody in this Texas town would look in the eye, the man they whispered about in fear, the cowboy who never removed his gloves even in the scorching heat. Everyone said marrying him meant disappearing into darkness, but Meen Zhao had already lost everything that mattered, and she'd learned that sometimes the most dangerous choice is the only one that leads to freedom. If you're watching, please like this video and comment what city you're in. I want to see how far this story travels across the world. The stagecoach rattled to a stop in front of the general store, and Meen Zhao stepped down onto Texas soil with nothing but a canvas bag and a folded piece of newspaper clutched in her hand. The heat hit her like a wall, dry, relentless, so different from the humid warmth of Guangdong that it felt like stepping onto another planet. Dust coated everything. The wooden buildings, the horses tied to posts, the faces of the people who turned to stare at her. She didn't need to speak their language fluently to understand what those stares meant. She'd seen them before in San Francisco, in every town between there and here. The eyes that measured her clothes, her skin, her hair twisted into a tight bun. The eyes that decided she didn't belong before she'd even opened her mouth. Meen straightened her spine and walked toward the saloon where the stagecoach driver had pointed when she'd asked, in her careful, accented English, where she might find information about employment. Behind her, she heard the whispers start. She always heard them. The saloon door swung open as a man stumbled out, already drunk though the sun hadn't reached its peak. He nearly collided with her, then jerked back as if she'd burned him. "Watch where you're going," he slurred, but his eyes held something sharper than alcohol. "We don't need your kind here." Meen stepped around him without responding. She'd learned that silence often protected her better than words. Inside the saloon, the piano music stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every head turned toward her. Cowhands, gamblers, the woman behind the bar with rouge on her cheeks and weariness in her eyes. The bartender, a thick-necked man with a scar across his knuckles, moved toward her. "We don't serve. I'm not here to drink." Meen's English came out steady, each word carefully shaped. She'd practiced for months during the journey, knowing her survival might depend on being understood. "I'm looking for work, or information about..." She unfolded the newspaper clipping, smoothing it against the bar top. The bartender glanced down at it, and something changed in his expression. Not softness. Texas didn't seem to breed soft men, but something closer to alarm. "Where'd you get that?" "San Francisco. The newspaper there prints advertisements from across the West." She kept her hand on the paper, though several men had moved closer to look. "It says a rancher needs a wife. No experience necessary. No questions asked." A laugh erupted from one of the card tables, harsh, edged with disbelief. "Lady, you can't be serious. That's Ethan Crowe's notice." "Then I would like to know where to find Mr. Crowe's." The laughter died. In its place came something heavier, the kind of silence that pressed against eardrums and made breathing difficult. The woman behind the bar spoke up, her voice lower than the men's, but carrying more authority. "Honey, that advertisement's been running for near on 2 years. Nobody answers it. Nobody in their right mind would." "Why?" Meen met her eyes directly, the way her mother had taught her never to do with men in power. But this woman wasn't a man, and Meen was tired of lowering her gaze. "Because Ethan Crowe ain't right." The bartender leaned forward, his breath smelling of tobacco and morning whiskey. "He don't come to town except when he has to. Don't speak to nobody. Don't let nobody on his land. There's stories about him, things that happened years back before he shut himself up at Northridge Ranch." "What kind of stories?" "The kind that keep decent people away." An older man stood from his table, his hat shadowing his face. "The kind involving blood and screaming and things that can't be explained by Christian doctrine. You want my advice, girl? Get back on that stage and head anywhere but here." Meen looked down at the advertisement again. The words were simple, almost crude in their brevity. "Wife wanted, Northridge Ranch. No experience necessary. No questions asked. Room and board provided. Apply in person." She'd read those words 100 times during the journey from California. She'd memorized the desperate simplicity of them, the way they promised nothing except the bare minimum: shelter, food, a legal arrangement. It was more than she had now, More than she'd had since the fire that took her uncle's store and left her with nowhere to go, no family on this continent, no money for passage back to China, even if she'd wanted to return to a country that had already buried her parents and married off her sisters. "Where is this ranch?" she asked. "You're not listening," the bartender started. "I heard everything you said. Where is Northridge Ranch?" The woman behind the bar studied her for a long moment, then sighed. 5 miles north. Follow the main road until you see the split oak, then take the eastern fork. You'll know it when you see it. There's an iron gate with a name burned into the crossbeam. But I'm telling you, honey, whatever you're running from can't be worse than what you're running toward. Meen had learned not to trust that particular assurance. People who'd never been truly desperate always underestimated what desperation could survive. She folded the newspaper clipping back into her pocket. "Thank you for the directions." Outside, the heat wrapped around her like a living thing. The few people on the street had multiplied into a small crowd, all pretending not to watch her while watching her completely. Meen walked past them toward the general store, where she needed to purchase supplies for the journey to Northridge Ranch. A canteen, some hardtack, maybe a shawl. The nights in Texas seemed to swing from furnace hot to surprisingly cold. Inside the store, the clerk, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, regarded her with the same wariness everyone else had shown. "I need supplies," she said, setting her few coins on the counter. "Water, food, enough for a day's walk." A day's walk where? She saw no reason to lie. Northridge Ranch. The clerk's hand froze halfway to the shelf. "You're the woman who was asking about Crowe's advertisement." News traveled fast in small towns. Meen had noticed that in every settlement she'd passed through. "Yes, will you sell me supplies or not?" He hesitated, then began gathering items. A small canteen, some dried meat, a handful of hardtack biscuits wrapped in brown paper. His movements were quick, nervous, like he wanted her out of his store as fast as possible. "That'll be," he calculated quickly, $2. It was more than the items were worth, but Meen had also learned that arguing rarely changed predetermined prejudices. She counted out the coins, then added one more. "I need a map, or directions I can write down." The clerk pocketed the money and grabbed a scrap of paper, sketching quickly. "Main road north, split oak, eastern fork, can't miss the gate." He pushed the paper across the counter like it burned his fingers. "But miss, if you got any sense at all, thank you." Meen gathered her supplies and left before he could finish the warning she'd already heard 3 times. The walk out of town felt longer than walking into it. Every step carried the weight of those stairs, the whispered conversations that started up again as soon as she passed. A woman called out from a doorway, something Meen didn't quite catch, but the tone was clear enough. Pity mixed with contempt. The assumption that she didn't understand what she was doing. Maybe she didn't, but she understood what she was leaving behind. Nothing. And nothing was surprisingly easy to abandon. The main road north cut through flat, harsh country. Scrub brush and scattered mesquite trees offered little shade. The sun climbed higher, pressing down on her shoulders, making her wish she'd bought a hat instead of a shawl. Her feet, used to the wooden floors of her uncle's store and the cobblestones of San Francisco's Chinatown, ached in her worn boots. But Meen had crossed an ocean in the belly of a ship that smelled like death and vomit. She'd survived San Francisco's prejudice and her uncle's strict household and the fire that took everything. 5 miles in the Texas heat was nothing compared to what she'd already endured. The split oak appeared after 2 hours of walking, a massive tree struck by lightning at some point, its trunk divided into 2 reaching arms. Meen took the eastern fork, and the landscape began to change. The road rose slightly, offering views of rolling hills in the distance. Wildflowers dotted the roadside, bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush adding splashes of color to the endless brown and green. It might have been beautiful if Meen had the luxury of appreciating beauty. The iron gate appeared as the sun started its descent. Just as the woman in the saloon had said, impossible to miss. 2 tall posts supported a crossbeam with words burned deep into the wood. Northridge Ranch. The gate stood open, as if visitors were expected, though the road beyond looked untraveled enough to suggest they rarely came. Meen stopped, her hand resting on the warm iron. This was the moment of choice, the last moment she could turn back, return to town, Find some other solution to her homelessness and poverty. Work as a laundress, maybe. Or a seamstress. Something that would let her survive in the margins of this hostile place. But she'd been surviving in margins her whole life, and she was tired of it. She walked through the gate. The road wound between fenced pastures where cattle grazed, their dark shapes moving slowly in the heat. The grass looked healthier here, greener. Someone was taking care of this land, whatever else might be true about its owner. In the distance, Meen could see buildings, a main house, a barn, several smaller structures. Smoke rose from a chimney despite the heat, suggesting someone was home. As she got closer, details emerged. The house was 2 stories, built from dark wood that had weathered to a silver gray. The porch wrapped around the front, and rocking chairs sat empty in the shade. The barn looked sturdy, well-maintained. Everything spoke of a working ranch, not the abandoned horror the townspeople's warnings had suggested. Meen was 20 feet from the porch steps when the door opened. The man who stepped out was tall, taller than anyone she'd seen in town, with shoulders broad enough to block the doorway. He wore dark clothes despite the heat, black trousers, a black shirt with the sleeves rolled down and buttoned at the wrists, a leather vest that looked more like armor than decoration. His hat shadowed his face, but Meen could see dark hair touching his collar and a jaw covered with several days' worth of beard. But what struck her most were the gloves, heavy leather gloves that covered his hands completely, fastened tight at the wrists. "You're on private property." His voice was deep, rough from disuse. Not threatening exactly, but not welcoming either. Meen set down her bag and pulled out the newspaper clipping. "Are you Ethan Crowe?" Silence. The man didn't move, didn't acknowledge the question, but he didn't deny it either. "I'm here about your advertisement." She held up the paper. "For a wife." More silence. Then, "That advertisement is old. It's still running. I saw it 2 weeks ago in San Francisco. I should have canceled it." He turned slightly, as if to go back inside. "But you didn't." Meen climbed the first step. "It says no experience necessary. No questions asked. I'm not experienced, and I have no questions. Just needs." He turned back, and for the first time she caught a glimpse of his face beneath the hat's shadow. Hard features, weathered by sun and wind and something else, something that looked like pain carved into permanent lines. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they studied her with an intensity that made her want to step back. She didn't step back. "You don't know what you're asking for," he said. "I'm asking for room and board in exchange for being your wife. That's what the advertisement offers." "The town tell you about me?" "Yes." "And you came anyway?" "Yes." "Why?" It was the first real question he'd asked, and Meen considered lying, considered softening the truth into something more palatable. But the advertisement had said no questions asked, which suggested this man might appreciate honesty more than pleasant fiction. "Because I have nowhere else to go," she said. "No family, no money, no prospects. Your advertisement promises shelter and food, and that's more than I currently have." "That's all you want? Shelter and food?" "For now." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but a fractional relaxation of the hardness. "You're not afraid of me." "Should I be?" "Everyone else is." "Everyone else isn't standing on your porch asking to marry you." Meen met his eyes directly. "If you were going to hurt me, you would have done it already. You're not. So either accept my offer or tell me to leave, but stop trying to scare me away with silence." For a long moment, Ethan Crowe didn't move. Then he pulled off his hat, revealing a face that might have been handsome if it didn't look so haunted. "I don't know why that advertisement's still running. I put it in the paper 2 years ago when I thought maybe I could—" He trailed off, then shook his head. "Doesn't matter. Nobody answered it. I figured nobody would." "I answered it. You're not from here." "Obviously. I mean, you don't know what you're walking into." "Then tell me." But he didn't. He just stood there, this tall, silent man in his black clothes and his leather gloves, looking at her like she was a problem he hadn't expected and didn't know how to solve. Finally, he said, "There are conditions." "I assumed there would be." "I need someone who can keep house, cook, clean, help with the ranch work when needed. In exchange, you get room, board, and legal protection as my wife." "That sounds fair." "You don't touch me. he continued, and his voice went harder. Ever. You don't ask questions about my past or why I live the way I do. You don't go into town spreading stories. You keep to yourself and let me keep to myself. The terms were strange, especially the first one. What kind of marriage involved never touching? But Meen had learned that normal was a luxury poor people couldn't afford. Agreed, she said. He stared at her a moment longer as if waiting for her to change her mind. When she didn't, he nodded once. There's a preacher in town. We'll go tomorrow. Make it legal. Tomorrow? You want to wait longer? No. Meen picked up her bag. Tomorrow is fine. Ethan stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. Guest room's upstairs, second door on the left. You can settle in tonight. We leave at dawn. Meen climbed the steps and paused at the threshold. Up close, she could see that Ethan Crowe was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 30, though the hardness in his face aged him. She could also see that his gloves weren't just worn for show. They were fastened with small buckles at the wrists, secured tight. Deliberate, like locks on a door. Thank you, she said, and meant it. He didn't respond, just stepped back to give her room to enter. The house interior was dim after the bright sunlight, but clean. Surprisingly clean for a bachelor's home. Wooden floors swept clear of dust. Simple furniture, a table, chairs, a bookshelf against one wall. Everything functional, nothing decorative. Kitchen's through there, Ethan pointed to a doorway. Pantry's stocked. Make whatever you want for supper. I'll be in the barn. He left before she could respond, the door closing behind him with a quiet finality. Meen stood in the silence of her new home and felt the weight of the day settle onto her shoulders. She'd done it. She'd walked into the unknown and claimed it as her own. Tomorrow she'd marry a stranger. Tomorrow her life would change in ways she couldn't predict. But tonight she had a roof over her head and food in the pantry, and that was enough. The guest room was small but clean, a bed with a patchwork quilt, a dresser, a window overlooking the western pastures. Meen set her bag on the bed and moved to the window. In the distance, she could see Ethan's dark figure entering the barn. He moved like a man carrying weight, his shoulders hunched slightly forward. Whatever had happened to him, whatever the town feared, it had marked him deeply. Meen turned away from the window and began unpacking her few possessions. A change of clothes, a small wooden box containing her mother's jade bracelet, the only thing of value she owned, the only thing she hadn't sold during the desperate months after the fire. A bundle of letters from her sisters in China, written before they'd married and stopped corresponding with the family member who'd shamed them by leaving. She arranged these items carefully in the dresser, then went downstairs to explore the kitchen. It was well equipped, a cast-iron stove, copper pots hanging from hooks, shelves lined with jars and tins. The pantry held flour, cornmeal, dried beans, salt pork, coffee. More than enough to make a decent meal. Meen had learned to cook in her uncle's household, though he'd complained constantly that she cooked Chinese food wrong and American food like a foreigner. She'd never been able to please him. But Ethan Crowe hadn't married her for her cooking skills. He'd married her because she'd shown up when nobody else would. That was a low bar to clear. She made rice, the one thing she could cook perfectly every time, and beans seasoned with salt pork and a touch of dried chili she found in the pantry. Simple food, but filling. As the rice steamed and the beans simmered, she set the table for two, then hesitated. Ethan had said he'd be in the barn. Should she call him or wait? The decision was made for her when the door opened and Ethan entered, carrying a bucket of fresh milk. He stopped when he saw the table set, something unreadable crossing his face. I made supper, Meen said. I hope that's all right. You didn't have to. I know, but I was hungry, and it seemed wasteful to cook only for myself. He set the milk bucket by the sink and moved to wash his hands, still wearing the gloves. The water ran over the leather, darkening it, but he didn't remove them even to scrub his fingers clean. They ate in silence. Ethan sat across from her, his hat on the chair beside him, his dark eyes focused on his plate. He ate mechanically, without pleasure or comment. Meen watched him between bites, trying to understand the man she'd agreed to marry. He was careful. That much was obvious. Careful in how he moved, how he held his fork, how he never let his gloved hands touch anything longer than necessary. It was the carefulness of someone who'd learned that mistakes had consequences. The rice is good, he said finally, breaking the silence. Thank you. You cook Chinese? Sometimes, if you want me to. I don't care what you cook as long as it's edible. He took another bite, chewed, swallowed. Where in China are you from? Guangdong, a village near Canton. How'd you end up in Texas? My uncle sent for me after my parents died. He had a store in San Francisco. He thought I could help with the business. She didn't mention how helping had meant working 16 hours a day for no pay while he sold her labor to other merchants. The store burned down 6 months ago. My uncle died in the fire. And you came here. Eventually, I tried to find work in San Francisco, but she gestured at her face, her clothes. People don't trust outsiders. No, Ethan said quietly. They don't. Something in his tone suggested he understood that particular truth from personal experience. After supper, Meen washed the dishes while Ethan disappeared back outside. She heard him moving around the barn, the sound of animals settling for the night, the creak of hinges and the thud of gates closing. By the time he came back inside, full darkness had fallen and Meen had retreated to the guest room. She lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her. Footsteps in the hallway. A door closing. Water running somewhere below. The ordinary sounds of another person living nearby. It had been a long time since she'd heard those sounds. The store had been silent after her uncle died, just her and the ghosts and the smell of smoke that never quite faded. This was better, different, strange, uncertain, but better. Tomorrow she would marry Ethan Crowe. Tomorrow she would become the wife of the man everyone feared. But tonight, she was simply a woman in a clean bed, in a safe house, with food in her belly. And that was more than she'd had yesterday. Dawn came cold and blue. Meen woke to the sound of roosters and dressed in her only good outfit, a dark green dress that her uncle's wife had given her, altered to fit Meen's smaller frame. It wasn't a wedding dress, but it was clean and whole, and that would have to be enough. Downstairs, she found Ethan already waiting. He'd shaved and changed into a clean black shirt, though he still wore the gloves and the same dark vest. His horse stood saddled outside, a large bay gelding with intelligent eyes. You ride? Ethan asked. No? Then you'll ride with me. He helped her mount, careful not to actually touch her, his gloved hands creating a barrier between them, then swung up behind her. The horse shifted under their combined weight, then settled. The ride to town took less than an hour. Ethan rode in silence, his body careful not to press against hers, even though the saddle forced them close. Meen could feel the heat of him behind her, the rhythm of his breathing, the tension in his frame that never quite relaxed. The town looked different in morning light, less hostile, more indifferent. A few early risers watched them pass, their eyes widening when they recognized Ethan. Word would spread quickly. By noon, everyone would know that the Chinese woman had actually gone through with it. The church was a small white building at the edge of town. The preacher, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and worry lines around his mouth, met them at the door. Ethan, he said carefully, I heard you might be coming. We need to be married, legal and witnessed. The preacher's eyes shifted to Meen. Miss, do you understand what you're doing? Yes. Has anyone explained? She understands, Ethan cut in. Can you perform the ceremony or not? I can, the preacher sighed. Come inside. The ceremony was brief, stripped of poetry or warmth. The preacher read the necessary words in a flat voice. Ethan repeated his vows without inflection. Meen spoke hers clearly, each word deliberate. When the preacher said, You may kiss the bride, Ethan stepped back. We'll skip that part, he said. The preacher didn't argue. He produced the marriage certificate, had them both sign, then added his own signature and seal. There, you're legally wed. May you find what you're looking for. It wasn't quite a blessing, but it was close enough. Outside, Ethan helped Meen back onto the horse. A small crowd had gathered, curious faces, whispering mouths. Meen saw the woman from the saloon, her expression a mix of pity and disbelief. She saw the general store clerk shaking his head. Let them stare. Let them judge. She'd survived worse than their opinions. As they rode out of town, Ethan spoke for the first time since the ceremony. You can still change your mind. Get the marriage annulled. I wouldn't fight it. Why would I change my mind? Because you don't know what you've signed up for. Then tell me. But he didn't. He just urged the horse faster, putting distance between them and the town, between them and the staring faces and the weight of other people's fear. Back at Northridge Ranch, Meen moved her things from the guest room to the room Ethan indicated, a bedroom on the first floor, small but private, with its own door that locked from the inside. His room, she noticed, was upstairs, as far from hers as the house's layout allowed. "You can change whatever you want," he said, gesturing at the sparse furnishings. "Paint, curtains, furniture, whatever makes it yours." "Thank you." He nodded and left her alone. Over the following days, Meen learned the rhythms of Northridge Ranch. She woke before dawn to make coffee and breakfast. She cleaned the house, which stayed remarkably tidy because Ethan barely used it. She cooked supper each evening and set the table for two, though they rarely spoke during meals. Ethan worked from sunup to sundown. She'd watch him from the window, mending fences, tending cattle, repairing the barn roof. He worked with a fierce, focused intensity, as if stillness might kill him. And always, always he wore the gloves. Even in the scorching afternoon heat, even when sweat darkened his shirt and ran down his face, he never took them off. Meen didn't ask why. She'd agreed not to, and she kept her word. But she noticed other things. The way Ethan never ate with his hands, always used utensils. The way he opened doors with his elbow or shoulder when possible. The way he positioned himself in every room so that his back faced a wall and he could see all the exits. These were the habits of someone who'd learned to fear himself. On the fourth day, Meen was hanging laundry when she heard a horse approaching. She turned to see a rider coming up the road, a man in a sheriff's star, his face grim. Ethan appeared from the barn before the sheriff even dismounted. "Sheriff," he said flatly. "Ethan, heard you got married. That's legal and none of your business." "It is if there's trouble involved." The sheriff's eyes found Meen. "Ma'am, I need to ask, are you here of your own free will?" "Yes," Meen said. "Nobody forced you or threatened you?" "No." "You understand you can leave any time? There are people in town who'd help." "I don't need help." Meen stepped forward, positioning herself closer to Ethan. "I made my choice. I'm staying." The sheriff studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but if that changes..." He handed Ethan a piece of paper. "Got this telegram for you, from up north." Ethan took it with his gloved hands, his jaw tightening as he read. "Thanks. Everything all right?" "Fine." It clearly wasn't, but the sheriff knew better than to push. He tipped his hat to Meen and rode away. Ethan stood frozen, staring at the telegram. Meen moved closer. "Bad news?" she asked quietly. "Nothing that concerns you." But his hands were shaking. Even through the gloves, she could see the tremor. "Ethan, I need to go into town." He crumpled the telegram and shoved it in his pocket. "I'll be back before dark." He was gone before she could respond, riding out at a pace that suggested he was running from something rather than toward it. Meen watched him disappear down the road, then bent to pick up the laundry she'd dropped. As she did, she saw it, a small scorch mark on the fence post where Ethan had been standing, the wood blackened as if by intense heat. She touched it carefully, still warm. Whatever secret Ethan Crowe was hiding, it was more than just a dark past or a troubled mind. It was something that could burn. Ethan didn't return before dark. Meen waited through supper, keeping the food warm on the stove, watching the road from the kitchen window as twilight bled into full night. The coffee she'd made grew cold in its pot. The beans congealed in their sauce. Still no sign of him. She told herself it didn't matter. They weren't a real married couple, just two people sharing a house and a legal document. If he wanted to disappear into town for the night, that was his business. But the scorch mark on the fence post kept drawing her back outside. She touched it 3 more times throughout the day, and each time it had been cooler, the heat fading like a dying ember. By evening, it was just charred wood, no different from a lightning strike or a careless dropped match. Except Ethan hadn't been holding a match, and lightning didn't strike on clear days. Meen finally gave up waiting and went to bed. She lay in the small first-floor bedroom, listening to the house creak and settle around her. Strange how quickly she'd grown accustomed to the sounds of this place. The wind rattling the shutters, the cattle lowing in distant pastures, the barn door that needed its hinges oiled. These were the sounds of her new life, and they were becoming familiar in a way nothing had been familiar since she'd left China. She must have dozed off, because the sound of the front door opening jerked her awake. Heavy footsteps crossed the main room. A chair scraped against the floor, the clink of a bottle against glass. Meen rose and pulled on her robe, then ventured into the hallway. She found Ethan sitting at the kitchen table, still wearing his coat and gloves despite the warmth of the room. A whiskey bottle stood open before him, and he was pouring a second glass with hands that still trembled slightly. He looked up when she entered, and even in the dim lamplight she could see the exhaustion carved into his face. "Did I wake you?" "It's all right." She moved to the stove and began reheating the coffee. "You didn't eat. I can warm the food." "Not hungry." "You should eat something." "I said I'm not hungry." His tone was sharper than necessary, and he seemed to realize it because he added more quietly, "Sorry, long day." Meen poured the reheated coffee into a clean cup and set it in front of him. He stared at it for a moment, then pushed the whiskey aside and wrapped his gloved hands around the warm ceramic. "Thank you," he said. She sat down across from him. "The telegram was bad news. I asked you not to question me." "I'm not questioning. I'm observing." Meen met his dark eyes steadily. "You left here shaking. You came back hours late, drinking. Something happened." Ethan took a long drink of the coffee, then set the cup down carefully. "There's a man up in Montana. Someone I used to know. He's dying and he wants to see me before he goes." "Are you going?" "No." "Why not?" "Because some bridges are better left burned." He picked up the whiskey glass, reconsidered, set it back down. "He's the one who... He was there when everything went wrong, when I became what I am." It was the most personal thing he'd shared since she'd arrived. Meen waited, not pushing, letting the silence stretch. "I was different before," Ethan continued, his voice low and rough. "Younger, stupider. I thought I could control things that weren't meant to be controlled. He encouraged that, pushed me toward choices I wasn't ready for." "What kind of choices?" But Ethan shook his head. "Doesn't matter now. What's done is done, and there's no undoing it. I told the telegraph operator to send a message back, that I'm not coming." Meen watched him stare into his coffee cup, his shoulders hunched like a man bracing against a storm only he could feel. Whatever had happened in his past, it had marked him in ways that went deeper than scars. "The fence post," she said quietly. "By the barn. It's burned." Ethan's hands tightened around the cup. "I know." "How did it happen?" "You agreed not to ask questions." "I agreed not to ask about your past. The fence post is present tense." He almost smiled at that. Not quite, but close. "You're sharp. That's going to be a problem." "For who?" "For me, probably." He stood, leaving the coffee half finished. "Get some sleep, Meen. Morning comes early on a ranch." He left her sitting alone at the table, his footsteps heavy on the stairs leading to his second-floor room. Meen heard the door close, the scrape of something being pushed against it. More barriers, more locks. Whatever Ethan Crowe was hiding, he was terrified of it. The next morning brought rain, the first since Meen had arrived. It started as a light drizzle during breakfast and built into a steady downpour by midday. Ethan worked through it anyway, coming back to the house soaked and mud-spattered to grab tools from the shed, then disappearing again into the gray curtain of water. Meen spent the day baking. She'd found flour and lard in the pantry, along with dried apples and cinnamon, and she set about making the apple pastries her mother had taught her as a girl. The kitchen filled with sweet warmth, steam fogging the windows, and for a few hours she could almost pretend she was somewhere else, somewhere safe and familiar. When Ethan came in for supper, he stopped in the doorway and stared at the pastries cooling on the counter. "What are those?" "Apple turnovers. They'll keep for several days if you store them properly." He moved closer, studying them with an expression she couldn't quite read. "My mother used to make something like this." It was the first time he'd mentioned family. Meen filed that information away carefully. "Does she still?" "She died when I was 12. I'm sorry." Ethan shrugged, but the gesture was stiff. "Long time ago." He picked up one of the pastries, examined it, set it back down. "You don't have to do all this, the cooking, the cleaning. I can manage." "I know, but I'm here and I need something to do." "You could rest, read. There are books in the front room. I'd rather be useful. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. You're not a servant, Meen. You're my wife. Legally, at least. And legally you provide room and board. Everything else I do is my choice. Still. He hesitated, then added, thank you. For the food. For staying. It was such a small thing, those 2 words, that acknowledgement, but they settled into Meen's chest like warmth spreading through cold water. Over the next 2 weeks, they fell into a rhythm. Ethan worked the ranch, and Meen kept the house. They ate meals together in near silence, occasional comments about the weather or the cattle breaking through the quiet. Ethan never removed his gloves, never let his guard down, but he also stopped trying to push her away. And Meen watched. She watched the way he moved through the world like a man walking on cracked ice, every step measured and careful. She watched him work himself to exhaustion every day, as if stillness might let something terrible catch up to him. She watched the way he positioned himself in doorways, never letting anything get behind him. She also noticed the things he tried to hide. The way he gripped door handles until the wood creaked. The scorched handprints that occasionally appeared on fence posts or barn walls, always when he thought no one was looking. The nights when she'd wake to hear him pacing upstairs back and forth, like a caged animal. On the 15th day of their marriage, a neighbor rode up to the house, a rancher named Thomas Garrett from the property to the west. He was a thick-shouldered man in his 50s with a weathered face and cautious eyes. Meen was hanging laundry when he arrived, and she saw Ethan emerge from the barn, his posture immediately defensive. Garrett, Ethan said, not quite a greeting. Crowe. The neighbor shifted in his saddle. Heard you got yourself a wife. Thought I'd stop by, see if it's true. It's true. That your only business? Easy now, just being neighborly. Garrett's eyes found Meen. Ma'am, name's Thomas Garrett. I run the ranch just west of here. Meen nodded politely. Meen Crowe. Something flickered across Garrett's face at the name. Surprise, maybe? Or doubt that she'd actually taken Ethan's surname. Well, that's fine then. Just wanted to make sure everything's proper. It's legal and documented, Ethan said flatly. Anything else? Actually, yeah. Got a problem with a cougar taking my calves. I thought maybe you'd want to join the hunt. Few of the ranchers are meeting tomorrow at dawn. The silence that followed was thick enough to touch. Ethan stood perfectly still, his gloved hands clenched at his sides. No, he said finally. Could use the help. This cat's been... I said no. Garrett's jaw tightened. Look, I know you keep to yourself and that's your business. But this affects all of us. That cougar's going to work its way through every ranch in the area if we don't, then handle it yourself. Ethan's voice had gone cold. You've got plenty of men who'll help. You don't need me. Maybe I'm asking because I'm trying to be decent. Trying to treat you like a neighbor instead of what? Ethan took a step forward. Instead of the monster everyone thinks I am? The dangerous bastard who should be run out of town? Is that what you were going to say? Garrett's horse shifted nervously, picking up on the sudden tension. I wasn't going to say that. But you were thinking it. Everyone does. Ethan's hands were shaking now, that fine tremor Meen had learned to recognize. So do us both a favor and stop pretending you came here out of neighborly concern. You came to check if the Chinese woman was being held against her will. You've seen she's fine. Now leave. Garrett stared at him for a long moment, then tipped his hat to Meen. Ma'am, if you ever need anything, help of any kind, you know where to find me. He rode off, and Ethan stood watching until the dust settled behind him. Then he turned and walked toward the barn, his stride stiff with barely controlled anger. Meen finished hanging the laundry, then followed him. She found him in the barn, standing in one of the empty stalls, his forehead pressed against the wooden wall. His breath came in short, harsh bursts. Ethan, she said quietly. Don't. His voice was muffled. Just don't. He was trying to be kind. He was trying to figure out if I'd hurt you yet. Ethan pushed away from the wall, and Meen saw the handprint he'd left behind, scorched black into the wood, smoke still rising faintly from the edges. They're all waiting for it, waiting for me to prove them right, to lose control and become the thing they're afraid of. What thing? Meen moved closer, slowly, like approaching a spooked horse. What are they afraid of? Me. What I can do. What I've already done. Show me. He laughed, sharp and bitter. You don't want to see it. I've seen the handprints, the scorch marks. I know something's happening that you can't fully control. She stopped just outside the stall. Show me, Ethan. Let me decide for myself what to be afraid of. For a long moment, he just stared at her. Then, slowly, he began unbuckling one of his gloves. His fingers fumbled with the fastenings, and Meen realized he rarely removed them. The buckles were stiff from disuse. The glove came off, and Meen saw his hand for the first time. It looked normal at first, calloused, scarred from ranch work, the hand of a man who worked with his body. But as she watched, faint lines began to glow beneath the skin. Silver light traced patterns across his palm, up his fingers, disappearing under his sleeve. The marks pulsed like a heartbeat, growing brighter with each breath Ethan took. What is that? Meen whispered. A curse. A brand. A punishment. Take your pick. Ethan held his hand up, and the glow intensified. The temperature in the barn rose noticeably. They marked me, changed me, made me into something that can't be trusted around normal people. Who did? Men who thought they could harness power they didn't understand. I was young, stupid. I let them convince me I was special, that I could handle it. His hand was shaking badly now, the silver marks blazing bright. They were wrong. Meen could feel the heat radiating from him, see the way the straw on the ground had started to curl and blacken. But she didn't step back. What happened? She asked. There was a camp, 30 men, maybe more. They were experimenting, trying to bind power to flesh, make soldiers who could kill without weapons. I was one of the first who survived the process. His voice had gone hollow, but something went wrong during the final ritual. The power surged. I couldn't control it. The whole camp. He closed his hand into a fist, and flames licked between his fingers. Burned. Everyone burned. I was the only one who walked away. The flames died as quickly as they'd appeared, leaving his hand unmarked. The silver lines faded back to faint traces under his skin. That's why I wear the gloves, Ethan said quietly. That's why I keep everyone at a distance, because if I lose control again, if the power surges, you'll hurt someone. I'll kill them, just like I killed everyone in that camp. Meen studied his face, the guilt carved into every line, the fear that never quite left his eyes. How long ago did this happen? 8 years. And in those 8 years, how many people have you killed? He blinked. What? You heard me. How many people have died because you lost control? None. But that's because I've kept myself isolated, because I don't let anyone close enough to... So in 8 years of living with this power, you haven't hurt anyone. Meen took a step closer. That doesn't sound like a monster to me. That sounds like someone with incredible self-control. You don't understand. The power doesn't want to be controlled. It wants out. Every day I can feel it pushing against the barriers I've built, looking for cracks, for weaknesses. Then stop fighting it alone. Ethan stared at her. What? You've spent 8 years trying to control something you're terrified of, completely isolated, with no one to help or support you. Maybe that's why it feels so overwhelming. Maybe you need... I don't need anything. He pulled the glove back on, fumbling with the buckles, except for people to leave me alone. That's why I put up that advertisement. I thought if I had a wife legally, the town would stop sending the sheriff around, stop trying to force me into their community. I could have the protection of marriage without the actual... He gestured vaguely between them. Without the actual person, Meen finished. Yeah. Well, you got the person anyway, and I'm not leaving. You should. This isn't what you signed up for. I signed up for room and board in exchange for being your wife. That's what I'm getting. She moved closer, close enough now that she could see the silver mark still faintly visible through his shirt. You're afraid of yourself, Ethan. I understand that. But fear doesn't make you safe. It just makes you alone. Alone is safe. Alone means nobody gets hurt. Alone means nobody lives either. Meen reached out slowly, telegraphing her intention. I'm going to touch your arm. Over the shirt, over the glove. You're not going to hurt me. Don't. But she'd already done it, her hand settling gently on his forearm. Through the fabric, she could feel the heat of him, the tension in his muscles, the fine tremor that never quite stopped. Nothing burned. Nothing exploded. The world didn't end. Ethan stood frozen, staring at her hand on his arm, like it was the most terrifying thing he'd ever seen. "See?" Meen said softly. "I'm still here. Still alive. Still unburned." "That doesn't prove anything. You're touching fabric, not... It proves you're not the uncontrollable monster you think you are." She squeezed gently, then let go. "And it proves I'm not afraid of you." She left him standing in the barn and returned to the house. Behind her, she heard him exhale, a long, shaking breath that sounded like it had been held for years. That night, Ethan appeared for supper, actually hungry for the first time since she'd arrived. He still didn't talk much, but the silence felt different. Less like walls and more like a shared understanding that words weren't always necessary. After they ate, Meen brought out the book she'd been reading from his collection, a volume of poetry she'd found on the shelf. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You read English poetry?" "I'm learning. Some of the words I don't understand, but the feeling comes through anyway." "Which one are you reading?" She showed him the page. He read the title and smiled, an actual smile, small but real. "Wordsworth. My mother liked him too." "Did she teach you to read?" "Yeah, my father thought it was a waste of time, but she insisted." The smile faded. "She died of fever the winter I turned 12. After that, my father, he wasn't the same. Sent me away to work as soon as I was old enough." "That's how you ended up with the men who did this to you?" Ethan nodded slowly. "I was 16, angry at the world, and they offered purpose, power, a way to matter." He stared at his gloved hands. "I didn't understand what I was trading away until it was too late. Your humanity, my peace, my safety, any chance at a normal life." He looked up at her. "That's why I'm warning you, Meen. This isn't temporary. I'm not going to wake up one day cured. This is forever." "I know." "And you're still staying? I told you, I'm not afraid of you." "Maybe you should be." But there was less conviction in his voice now, less certainty that isolation was the only answer. Over the following weeks, small things began to change. Ethan started talking more during meals, sharing stories about the ranch, about the land, about the hard work of keeping cattle alive in Texas heat. Meen told him about China, about her childhood, about her journey across the ocean in a ship so crowded she couldn't lie down to sleep. They began working side by side, Meen helping with smaller tasks like feeding chickens and mending tack, while Ethan handled the heavy labor. He taught her to ride, patiently guiding her through the basics on the gentlest horse in his stable. She taught him phrases in Cantonese, laughing when his pronunciation mangled the tones beyond recognition. But Ethan still wore his gloves, still kept a careful distance, still disappeared into his room each night and pushed something against the door. Then came the storm. It rolled in on the 4th week of their marriage, massive thunderheads building on the western horizon, turning the sky the color of a bruise. Meen had seen storms in China, typhoons that tore roofs off houses and flooded entire villages. But she'd never seen lightning like this, great jagged bolts that split the sky and made the earth tremble. Ethan came in early, before the rain started, and began securing shutters and moving equipment into the barn. "This is going to be bad," he said, his voice tight. "You should stay inside. Don't go out no matter what you hear." "What about the animals?" "They're in the barn. They'll be fine." He paused, then added, "I might not come in tonight. If the storm gets bad, I'll stay in the barn. Make sure nothing catches fire." "Fire? In a rainstorm?" "Lightning can start fires even in rain. And He didn't finish the thought, didn't need to. The storm hit at dusk. Rain hammered the roof like bullets. Wind screamed around the corners of the house. Lightning turned night into day, over and over, each flash followed by thunder so loud it shook the windows in their frames. Meen sat at the kitchen table, a lamp burning low, trying to read but mostly just listening to the violence outside. She thought of Ethan in the barn, alone with his fear and his power and the lightning that might trigger something he couldn't control. She thought of him pushing her away, always pushing, always certain that isolation was the only safe choice. And she made a decision. The rain soaked her before she'd taken 3 steps from the porch. Maylene pushed through it, her nightgown plastered to her skin, her hair whipping across her face. The barn door was partially open, light spilling out into the darkness. Inside, she found Ethan standing in the center of the barn, his coat and gloves discarded on the ground. His shirt was open, and in the lightning flashes she could see the full extent of the marks. Silver lines covering his chest, his arms, his neck, all pulsing in rhythm with the thunder. His eyes were closed, his hands clenched into fists, and every breath looked like agony. "Ethan!" she called over the storm. His eyes snapped open, and they were glowing the same silver as the marks. "Get out. Now." "No." "Maylene, I can't." He gasped, doubling over. "The storm. It's too much. The power is—" Lightning struck somewhere close, the thunder simultaneous and deafening. The silver marks blazed brighter, and Ethan screamed. Flames erupted from his hands, scorching the barn floor, running up the walls in sheets of heat. Maylene ran toward him, not away. "What are you doing?" he shouted. "Get away from me!" "You're not doing this alone." She reached him, and his hands shot out to push her back. But she caught them, skin to skin, her hands on his, with nothing between them but heat and light and 8 years of fear. The flames didn't burn her. The power that surged through Ethan's body flowed into hers and stopped. Just stopped, like water hitting a dam. The silver marks on his arms flickered, dimmed, steadied. Ethan stared at their joined hands, his eyes still glowing, but losing that wild, desperate edge. "How? I don't know." Maylene tightened her grip. "But I'm not letting go." Another lightning strike. Another surge of power. But this time, with her hands on his, Ethan didn't collapse, didn't lose control. The energy flowed through him and into her and dissipated like heat into cool air. They stood like that through the worst of the storm, Maylene anchoring him, her presence somehow grounding the power that had ruled his life for 8 years. She didn't understand how or why, only that it worked. That for the first time since he'd been marked, Ethan Crowe wasn't facing his curse alone. When the storm finally broke and rolled east, leaving clear skies and the smell of rain-washed earth, they were both shaking. Maylene's hands were red where she'd gripped his, but not burned. Ethan's eyes had returned to their normal dark brown, and the silver marks had faded back to faint traces beneath his skin. "You shouldn't have been able to do that," he said hoarsely. "Nobody's ever been able to touch me when the power surges without burning," Maylene finished. "I know, but I did." "Why didn't it hurt you?" "I don't know. Maybe—" She looked down at their still joined hands. "Maybe you're not as dangerous as you think you are, or maybe you just needed someone brave enough to try." Ethan's fingers tightened around hers, just for a moment, just enough to acknowledge what had happened. Then he let go and stepped back. The old caution returning, the walls rebuilding, but not quite as high as before. They walked back to the house in silence, both soaked to the bone, their boots squelching in the mud the storm had left behind. The sky had cleared to reveal stars so bright they looked close enough to touch, and the air smelled clean, sage and wet earth, and the faint metallic tang that lightning always left in its wake. Inside, Maylene lit the lamps while Ethan stood dripping in the doorway, looking lost in his own home. The silver marks on his exposed skin had faded almost completely, leaving only the faintest trace of lines that might have been scars or shadows. "You should change," Maylene said, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, "before you catch pneumonia." "I don't get sick." His voice was distant, distracted. "Haven't since the marking. The power burns out illness before it can take hold." "Lucky you." "Is it?" He looked at her then, really looked at her, and there was something raw in his expression that made her chest tighten. "You touched me. During the surge. That should have killed you." "But it didn't." "That's not an answer. That's just restating the obvious." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping just short of reaching for her. "Why didn't it burn you, Maylene? What are you?" "I'm just a woman from Guangdong who married a stranger because she had nowhere else to go." She met his eyes steadily. "I'm not special. I don't have power or magic or whatever you think protected me. I just held on. Nobody just holds on through that. I've seen what happens when people touch me during a surge. I watched a man's hand turn to ash because he grabbed my shoulder trying to help during an episode 3 years ago. His screams, Ethan cut himself off, turning away. You shouldn't have been able to touch me. Maybe the power recognized that I wasn't trying to control you or stop you. Maybe it knew I was trying to help. Power doesn't think. It doesn't know anything. It just destroys. Then maybe you're wrong about what you are. Meen let the blanket fall and moved closer. Maybe for 8 years you've been so convinced you're a monster that you haven't stopped to consider. You might just be a man with a burden he's carrying alone. Ethan's laugh was sharp, bitter. A man doesn't leave scorch marks everywhere he touches. A man doesn't glow like a brand in a forge when thunderstorms roll through. A man also doesn't spend 8 years without hurting anyone if he's truly uncontrollable. She reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away. When he didn't, she placed her hand over his heart. Over the shirt, yes, but close enough that she could feel the heat of him, the rapid thud of his pulse. Your power didn't hurt me because you didn't want it to. Because even at your most afraid, even when you thought you were losing control, some part of you held back. His hand came up to cover hers, pressing it against his chest. The touch was careful, reverent almost, like he was handling something precious and breakable. I don't know how to trust that. Then practice. Start small. She could feel his heartbeat slowing under her palm, steadying. Take off the gloves during supper tomorrow. Let yourself exist without barriers for one meal. And if something happens, if I lose control, then I'll be there, just like I was tonight. For a long moment they stood like that, her hand on his heart and his hand covering hers, the space between them charged with something that felt more dangerous than any cursed power. Then Ethan stepped back, breaking the contact, and the careful walls reconstructed themselves in his expression. Get some sleep, he said quietly. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Storm probably damaged fences, maybe took down some trees. He left before she could respond, climbing the stairs to his room with heavy footsteps. Meen heard the familiar scrape of furniture being pushed against the door, the creak of floorboards as he paced. But later, much later, the pacing stopped. And in the silence that followed, Meen thought maybe, just maybe, he was learning to rest. Morning came with brilliant sunshine and the chaotic aftermath of the storm. 3 sections of fence were down. A cottonwood had fallen across the eastern pasture, and the chicken coop had lost half its roof. Ethan was already outside when Meen woke, his hat pulled low and his gloves firmly back in place. They worked through the morning heat, Meen helping where she could, holding boards steady while Ethan hammered, gathering scattered tools, bringing water when his canteen ran dry. He was quieter than usual, his movements economical and focused, but every so often she'd catch him looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. By noon they'd repaired 2 fence sections and cleared the fallen tree. Meen had returned to the house to prepare lunch when she heard horses approaching. Multiple riders, their voices carrying across the open land. She stepped onto the porch and counted 5 men, all armed, all wearing expressions that ranged from grim determination to barely concealed hostility. The leader was a thick-set man with a marshal's badge pinned to his vest and eyes the color of flint. Ethan emerged from the barn, and Meen saw his whole body go rigid. His hand drifted toward his hip where a gun should have been. But he didn't carry one, she'd noticed. Never had, in all the weeks she'd been here. Marshal Dutton, Ethan said flatly. This is private property. I'm aware. The marshal dismounted, his hand resting casually on his own gun. Got some questions for you, Crowe, about the fire at the Henderson place last night. What fire? Don't play stupid. Lightning struck their barn during the storm. Whole thing went up. They lost 4 horses and near about lost their daughter when she tried to save them. Meen's stomach dropped. She could see where this was going, could see the accusation forming before the marshal even spoke it. That's a tragedy, Ethan said carefully. But I don't see what it has to do with me. Funny thing about that fire. Henderson says it didn't burn like a normal lightning strike, says the flames were wrong, hotter than they should have been, spreading faster, clinging to things that shouldn't burn. The marshal took a step forward. Says it reminded him of stories he's heard, about a certain rancher who's got an unnatural way with fire. I was here all night. My wife can confirm it. The marshal's eyes slid to Meen. That true, ma'am? He was here? Yes, sir, Meen said, moving to stand beside Ethan. All night. The storm was bad. We were both inside. Inside. Together. The marshal's tone made it clear what he thought of that claim. You expect me to believe that? I expect you to accept the word of a married woman about her husband's whereabouts. Meen kept her voice steady despite the fear crawling up her spine. Ethan was here. He had nothing to do with any fire. One of the other men spat into the dirt. Of course she's going to cover for him. Probably scared of what he'll do if she don't. I'm not scared of my husband. The words came out sharper than Meen intended. And I'm not a liar. He was here. Convenient, the marshal said. Storm hits, fire breaks out at the Henderson place, and Crowe's got an alibi from his brand new foreign wife, who don't know nobody in town, and's got no reason to tell the truth. Ethan's hands were clenched into fists, and Meen could see the tremor starting in his shoulders. She moved closer, close enough that her arm brushed his, and felt him startle at the contact. You have no evidence, Ethan said, his voice strained. No proof. Just suspicion based on rumors and fear. We got a pattern. Strange fires follow you wherever you go. That camp up north that burned 8 years ago? You were there. The warehouse fire in Abilene 5 years back? You'd been in town the week before. Now the Henderson barn goes up the same night we get the worst lightning storm in years. And you're here, glowing like a... I don't glow, Ethan interrupted, but his voice had gone hoarse. Your wife might cover for you, but others have seen things. Garrett mentioned strange lights coming from your barn during storms. The blacksmith says metal you bring him to repair has scorch marks that don't match normal use. People talk, Crowe, and what they're saying is that you're dangerous. The air around them had begun to heat up. Meen could feel it radiating off Ethan like a furnace door had opened. The silver marks were starting to show through his shirt, faint lines becoming visible as the fabric grew translucent from the heat building beneath. You need to leave, Ethan said through gritted teeth. Now, before what? Before you lose control? Before you prove us right? The marshal's hand tightened on his gun. I got authorization to bring you in for questioning. You can come peaceful, or we can do this the hard way. He's not going anywhere. Meen stepped directly in front of Ethan, blocking the marshal's line of sight. You have no evidence, no witnesses, nothing but prejudice and fear. You can't arrest a man for being different. Get out of the way, ma'am. No. Behind her, she heard Ethan's breathing growing ragged, felt the heat intensifying. The silver marks were blazing now. She could see their light reflecting off the marshal's face, off the wide eyes of the men who'd accompanied him. Meen. Ethan's voice was barely human. Move. Please. I can't hold it much longer. She reached back and found his hand, gloved, shaking, hot enough that she could feel the heat through the leather. She laced her fingers through his and squeezed hard. Yes, you can, she said quietly, just for him. You can, because you have to. Because losing control now means proving them right, and I won't let you do that. I can't. You can. You held back during the storm. You held back every day for 8 years. You can hold back now. The marshal had drawn his gun. Last warning, step aside or I'll move you myself. Meen felt the power surge through Ethan's body, felt it crest like a wave about to break. His hand in hers was burning now, the leather of the glove starting to smoke. In seconds, it would ignite. In seconds, he'd lose the battle he'd been fighting since the moment he was marked. Unless she gave him something stronger to hold on to than fear. Meen spun and threw her arms around Ethan, pressing her face against his chest where the silver marks blazed brightest. She felt the heat scorch her skin, felt the power writhe against her like something alive and desperate to escape. I'm here, she said against his heart. I'm here and I'm not burning and you are not going to hurt me. You are not a monster. You are not out of control. You are Ethan Crowe, and you are stronger than this curse. For one terrible moment, the power flared even brighter. Meen felt it rush toward her, felt certain it would consume them both in a column of fire that would prove every fear the town had ever harbored. But Ethan's arms came around her, wrapped tight, held on, and the power stopped. Just stopped, like a river hitting a dam it couldn't breach. The silver marks flickered, dimmed, faded back to faint traces beneath skin that was cooling, temperature dropping from furnace hot to merely warm. When Meen finally pulled back enough to look at his face, Ethan's eyes were his own again, dark and exhausted but human. Present. in control. She turned to face the marshal, her body still positioned between him and Ethan. He's not going anywhere, and if you try to take him, you'll have to go through me. The marshal stared at them, at Meen standing unburned despite having embraced a man who'd been glowing like hot iron moments before, at Ethan who'd somehow pulled back from the edge when everything suggested he should have exploded into violence. "This ain't over," the marshal said finally, holstering his gun. "Henderson's talking about pressing charges, about getting the territorial governor involved. You may have this woman fooled, Crowe, but the rest of us know what you are. Then the rest of you can stay away from my property." Ethan's voice was rough but steady. "And if Henderson wants to press charges for something I didn't do, tell him to get a lawyer, otherwise leave me alone." The marshal mounted his horse, but his eyes held a promise of future trouble. "Watch yourself. Next time you might not have someone to hide behind." They rode off, leaving dust and tension in their wake. Meen waited until they were out of sight before letting herself collapse onto the porch steps, adrenaline draining from her body in a rush that left her shaking. Ethan sat beside her, careful not to touch, his head in his hands. "You shouldn't have done that." "Probably not. I could have killed you. When the power surged, when I couldn't hold it back, you should have run." "Where would I run to?" Meen looked at him. "This is my home now. You're my husband. Running wasn't an option." "You're insane, you know that." "Maybe." She managed a weak smile. "But I'm also right. You didn't lose control. Even when you thought you would, even when everything was pushing you toward it, you held on. Because you wouldn't let go." Ethan's voice cracked. "Because you stood there like an idiot and gave me something more important to protect than my own fear." "Is that what I am? Something to protect?" "You're my wife." He said it like the word still surprised him. For better or worse, legal and binding. That means something even if this wasn't a real marriage when it started. Meen felt something shift in her chest, a realignment of understanding. "And now?" But Ethan stood before answering, putting distance between them again. "Now I need to check on the Henderson place, see how bad the damage is. Maybe if I help repair what burned, they'll back off." "That's a terrible idea. They'll just accuse you of returning to the scene." "Then what do you suggest? Because that marshal's right. This isn't over. Henderson's influential. If he pushes for charges, the territorial governor might actually listen. And if they come for me again?" He looked down at his gloved hands. "I might not be able to hold back a second time." Meen stood and brushed dust from her skirt. "Then we need to find out what really started that fire. Prove it was natural causes, just bad luck and lightning." "How?" "I don't know yet. But sitting here waiting for them to come arrest you isn't the answer." Over the next 3 days, Meen became a detective. She rode into town, alone, because Ethan's presence would only make things worse, and asked careful questions. She spoke to the blacksmith who'd repaired the Henderson barn roof last spring. She talked to the general store clerk who'd sold Henderson lamp oil 2 weeks ago. She even approached Mrs. Henderson herself, offering sympathy for the loss and asking gentle questions about the night of the fire. What she learned was troubling. The barn had been storing hay that Henderson had bought cheap from a supplier known for cutting corners. The lamp oil had been a discount brand, lower quality than what most ranchers used, and the roof, according to the blacksmith, had been repaired with green wood that Henderson had insisted on using to save money. Dry hay, poor quality lamp oil, green wood that could hold moisture and conduct lightning more effectively than seasoned timber. Meen wasn't an expert on fires, but she understood that sometimes accidents were just the result of poor choices compounding at the worst possible moment. She presented her findings to Ethan that evening over supper. For the first time since she'd asked, he'd removed his gloves to eat, his bare hands still careful, still controlled, but visible. The silver marks were faint in the lamplight, barely noticeable unless you knew to look. "It's not enough," he said after she'd finished explaining. "Henderson will say I'm just trying to shift blame. The marshal already thinks you're lying to protect me." "Then we need someone else to verify it, someone with authority who Henderson can't dismiss." "There is no one like that. I don't have allies in this town. I don't have friends. I have you, and a legal marriage certificate, and 8 years of people looking at me like I'm a bomb waiting to explode." Meen set down her fork. What about the man in Montana, the one who sent the telegram? Ethan's face went hard. What about him? He was there when you were marked. He knows what really happened at that camp. Maybe his testimony could... No. Ethan stood abruptly. I already told you. That bridge is burned. But if he's dying anyway, if he wants to see you before... I said no. The temperature in the room spiked, and Meen saw the silver marks flare bright for just a moment before Ethan forced them back down. Whatever he wants, whatever he knows, it doesn't matter. I'm not going to Montana. Even if his testimony could save you from being arrested? Even then. Ethan moved to the window, staring out into the darkness. You don't understand what that man did. What he cost me. Going to see him now would be... He cut himself off, shaking his head. It's not happening. Meen studied his rigid posture, the way his hands gripped the window frame hard enough to make the wood creak. Whatever history lay between Ethan and the man in Montana, it ran deeper than simple betrayal. Then we'll find another way, she said quietly. The other way presented itself 2 days later, though not in any form Meen could have anticipated. She was hanging laundry when a wagon rolled up to the house, a small covered wagon driven by a woman Meen had never seen before. The woman was young, maybe 25, with auburn hair and a determined set to her jaw. Mrs. Crowe? The woman called out. Yes? My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm a journalist with the Dallas Herald. I heard about your husband's situation, and I'd like to help. Meen's first instinct was suspicion. Help how? By telling the truth, by investigating Henderson's claims properly instead of just accepting the town's prejudice as fact. Sarah climbed down from the wagon, pulling a leather satchel with her. I've been following stories about people marked by power for 3 years now. Your husband isn't the only one. There's a pattern of persecution, of communities turning against people they don't understand. And you want to write about it? I want to document it, expose it, make people see that fear creates more monsters than any curse ever could. Sarah's eyes were bright with conviction. But I need your husband's cooperation. I need to interview him, understand what happened, get his side of the story. Meen was about to respond when Ethan appeared in the barn doorway. He took one look at Sarah Mitchell and turned to go back inside. Mr. Crowe, wait, Sarah called out. Please, 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Not interested. The territorial governor is reviewing Henderson's petition right now. If he decides there's merit to the charges, they'll send federal marshals. And federal marshals won't be as easy to convince as the local law. Sarah moved closer, her voice urgent. I can help you. I have contacts, resources, but I need your story. Ethan stopped walking. Why? Because I'm tired of watching innocent people get destroyed by fear and ignorance. Because my brother was marked with power 7 years ago, and he's in prison now for a fire he didn't start. Because someone needs to push back against the assumption that being different makes you dangerous. Slowly, Ethan turned around. Your brother. What kind of marks? Frost? Ice? He could freeze water with a touch. Sarah's voice went softer. They said he caused a blizzard that killed 3 people. He was locked in a cell when it happened, but they convicted him anyway, because fear doesn't need evidence. Meen watched something shift in Ethan's expression, the recognition of a shared experience, a common wound. 5 minutes, he said finally. That's all you get. They sat at the kitchen table, Sarah with her notebook, and Ethan with his walls firmly in place. Meen made coffee and listened as Sarah asked careful, probing questions about the camp, the marking, the years of isolation that followed. Ethan answered in short, clipped sentences, giving away as little as possible. But gradually, as Sarah demonstrated actual understanding instead of judgment, he began to open up. He told her about being young and angry and desperate for purpose, about the men who'd promised him power without explaining the cost, about waking up with silver marks burning beneath his skin and a camp full of dead men surrounding him. And you've lived alone since then? Sarah asked. Until recently. Sarah's eyes slid to Meen. Your wife. How did you meet? Advertisement. She needed shelter. I needed distance from the town's interference. Legal protection. Ethan's jaw tightened. It was supposed to be an arrangement, nothing more. But it became something more. That's not relevant to your story. Actually, it is. Sarah leaned forward. Because the narrative the town's built around you is that you're dangerous, uncontrollable, a threat to anyone who gets close. But your wife is sitting here unharmed after living with you for weeks. That contradicts everything they believe. Or it proves I'm good at hiding what I am until it's too late. Does it? Sarah looked at Meen. Mrs. Crowe, has your husband ever hurt you? Ever lost control in a way that put you in danger? Meen thought about the storm, about embracing Ethan while silver marks blazed across his skin and power surged through his body. No, never. Have you ever been afraid of him? Not of him. For him, sometimes. But never of him. Sarah made notes, her pen scratching across paper. What about the Henderson fire? Where was your husband when it started? Here. With me. The storm was violent. We stayed inside together. Together? Can anyone else verify that? No, Ethan said before Meen could answer. We're isolated out here. That's the point. Sarah nodded slowly, then asked the question Meen had been dreading. Mr. Crowe, have you ever started a fire intentionally? Used your power to cause harm? The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Ethan stared at his bare hands on the table, at the faint silver lines tracing patterns across his palms. Yes, he said finally. Once. 4 years ago. Meen's breath caught. This was new information, something he'd never mentioned. Tell me what happened, Sarah said quietly. There was a man, a drifter. He came to the ranch asking for work. I gave him a job, let him sleep in the barn. Ethan's voice had gone flat, emotionless. 3 days later, I found him in the house. He'd broken into my room, was going through my things, looking for money, valuables. When I confronted him, he pulled a knife. What did you do? I burned him. Not fatally, just enough to disarm him, make him run. He left the next morning, and I never saw him again. Did you report it to the law? No, because I knew how it would look. Man marked with firepower burned someone? They'd lock me up regardless of whether it was self-defense. Sarah made more notes. So the only time you've ever used your power against another person was to defend yourself in your own home. That's the only time I've used it intentionally. The camp. That was different. I didn't mean to kill anyone. I was trying to survive the ritual and the power got away from me. Because the ritual was designed wrong? Because the men conducting it didn't know what they were doing? Ethan nodded slowly. The leader. The man in Montana. He told me afterward that they'd pushed too hard, tried to bind too much power too fast. That what happened was their fault, not mine. His hands clenched into fists. But that didn't bring back the dead. Didn't change what I'd become. Sarah looked up from her notebook. Mr. Crowe, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Do you believe you started the fire at Henderson's barn? No, I was here. And even if I hadn't been, I don't lose control at a distance. The power doesn't work that way. Could someone else with similar marks have done it? Someone trying to frame you? Ethan's expression went very still. What? I told you I've been following these stories for 3 years. There are others like you out there. People marked with power, scattered across the territories. What if one of them? No. But Ethan's voice had lost its certainty. There's no one else. The camp was destroyed. Everyone died. Everyone except you. And the man in Montana who's currently dying and wants to see you. Sarah closed her notebook. Mr. Crowe, I think you should go to Montana. I think there are answers there you need. I'm not going. Then you might hang for a fire you didn't start. Because Henderson's pushing hard, and fear is a powerful motivator. The town wants to believe you're guilty. They need to believe it, because if you're innocent, they have to face the fact that they've been persecuting an innocent man for 8 years. Meen stood and moved to stand beside Ethan's chair. She's right. If there's even a chance that someone else started that fire, we need to know. And if the man in Montana has information, he destroyed my life. Ethan's voice cracked. He marked me, turned me into this, and then walked away while I burned everything to ash. Why would I give him the satisfaction of seeing me before he dies? Not for him, Meen said quietly. For you, for us, for the chance to finally know the whole truth about what happened that night. Ethan looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw 8 years of pain and isolation and fear. but also, just barely, the first fragile seed of hope that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone or as guilty as he'd believed. "I'll think about it," he said. It was the best answer they were going to get. The riders came 3 days after the storm, 6 men on horseback moving up the road to North Ridge Ranch like they owned it. Meen saw them first from the kitchen window where she was kneading bread dough, and something in the way they rode, tight formation, weapons visible, made her wipe her hands clean and step out onto the porch. Ethan emerged from the barn at the same moment, and she saw his whole body go rigid. He'd been working without his coat in the morning heat, just his shirt and vest. But now his gloved hands moved to his sides in a stance she'd learned meant danger. The lead rider was a lean man with a marshal's badge pinned to his vest and eyes that cataloged everything they touched. Behind him rode 5 others, hard men with the look of bounty hunters, their holsters worn smooth from use. "Ethan Crowe," the marshal said, not a question. "Marshal?" Ethan's voice was flat, controlled. "You're a long way from federal territory." "Got a warrant. You're wanted for questioning in connection with the massacre at Devil's Creek Camp, 1867. The marshal pulled a folded document from his coat. "Says here you're to be brought in to stand trial for the deaths of 32 men. Meen's breath caught. 32 men. The camp Ethan had told her about, the one that had burned when his power first manifested. She moved to the porch railing, her hands gripping the wood. "That was 8 years ago," Ethan said. "Nobody cared about Devil's Creek then. Why now?" "New evidence came to light, survivor testimony, enough to warrant a trial." The marshal's eyes shifted to Meen, then back to Ethan. "You can come peaceful, or we can do this hard. Your choice." "Who's the survivor?" Ethan asked. "Who testified?" "Man named Silas Cord says he was there the night it happened. Says he watched you burn those men alive." Something flickered across Ethan's face, recognition, and something darker. "Cord's a liar. He was part of it, part of the experiments. He knows exactly what happened." "Then you can tell your story to a judge, like, but you're coming with us either way." The marshal dismounted, and his men followed suit. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Crowe. We all know what you're capable of." Their hands moved to their weapons, not drawing, but ready. Meen saw the way they positioned themselves in a loose circle around Ethan, giving each other clear lines of fire. This wasn't an arrest. This was an execution waiting for an excuse. Ethan saw it, too. His shoulders went back, and Meen could see the tension radiating through him, the power responding to threat, to fear, building like pressure behind a dam. "Don't!" she called out, and every head turned toward her. "Ethan, don't!" "Ma'am, you need to step back inside," the marshal said. "This doesn't concern you." "He's my husband. That makes it my concern." Meen came down the porch steps, moving toward Ethan despite the marshal's warning. "You're not taking him. We have a legal warrant for something that happened 8 years ago, based on testimony from a man who was there doing the same things Ethan was accused of." She reached Ethan's side, close enough to feel the heat building in him. "If you want to arrest someone, arrest all of them. Everyone who was at that camp, everyone who participated in those experiments." "They're dead," one of the bounty hunters said. "All except Cord and Crowe here." "Convenient," Meen said. "The only 2 survivors, and one decides to testify against the other. What did they offer Cord? Immunity? Money?" The marshal's jaw tightened. "How we got the testimony doesn't change what's in it. Your husband killed 32 men. That's murder, no matter how you dress it up." "It was an accident," Ethan said quietly. "I didn't know what I was doing. Didn't know I could—" He stopped, his gloved hands clenching. "But it doesn't matter. They're dead because of me. That's the truth." "No." Meen turned to face him. "The truth is they're dead because of what they did to you, because they experimented on you like you were livestock, because they gave you power you never asked for and didn't teach you how to control it. That doesn't bring them back. And going with these men won't either. It'll just add your name to the list of people who died because of Devil's Creek." She grabbed his arm, feeling the heat through the fabric. "You told me the power responds to emotion, to fear and anger. So don't give it fear and anger. Give it something else." "Like what?" "Like the control you've been practicing for 8 years. She squeezed his arm. "Like the discipline that kept you from hurting anyone since then. like the strength it takes to walk away from a fight instead of toward it. The marshal moved closer, his hand on his gun now. "Ma'am, step away from him. Last warning." "Or what? You'll shoot an unarmed woman?" Meen didn't move. "Go ahead. Show everyone watching what kind of justice you're bringing to Northridge Ranch." She could feel Ethan shaking beside her, the power building in him like a coming storm. But underneath the fear and the anger, she felt something else, a thread of control, thin but present. The discipline he'd built through years of isolation, holding against the tide. "Ethan," she said softly, "remember the storm. Remember what we learned." His eyes met hers, still human but edged with that silver glow. "They'll kill me if I go with them. Stage an escape, shoot me in the back. I've seen how this works. Then don't go. They have a warrant. They have a piece of paper. You have a choice." She released his arm and stepped back, giving him space. "You can fight them and prove them right, that you're the monster they think you are. Or you can show them what 8 years of discipline looks like, what control means." The marshal was drawing his gun now, the other men following suit. "Crowe, you're under arrest. Put your hands up and come with us peacefully, or we will use force." Ethan looked at the 6 armed men, at the guns pointed at his chest, at Meen standing between him and the violence everyone expected. Then he slowly raised his hands, palms out, and Meen saw the silver marks glowing bright beneath his gloves. "I'll go with you," he said, "but on one condition." "You're not in a position to make conditions," the marshal said. "I am if you want me alive." Ethan's voice was steady, despite the power crackling through him. "The condition is this. My wife stays here, unharmed and unbothered. You don't question her, don't threaten her, don't come near this ranch again unless it's to return me. Break that condition and I will burn every single one of you to ash before you can pull your triggers." "That's a threat. That's a promise." The temperature around Ethan spiked, heat shimmering in the air. "I've spent 8 years controlling this power, keeping it locked down, but I can let it out anytime I want, and if you hurt her, I will." The marshal and his men took an involuntary step back. Meen could see the calculation in their eyes. Was it worth the risk? Could they actually kill him before he killed them? "Fine," the marshal said finally. "Your wife stays here, unharmed. You have my word." "Your word and your badge. Give them both to her." "What?" "You heard me. Give her your badge as insurance. If something happens to me, she takes it to the nearest federal office and tells them a marshal threatened a civilian. That'll end your career real quick." The marshal's face darkened, but he unpinned his badge and held it out. Meen came forward and took it, the metal warm from his body heat. "I'll keep this safe," she said, "until you bring my husband home." Ethan allowed them to bind his hands, regular rope, not iron manacles, because none of them wanted to get close enough to fasten metal around his wrists. They put him on a horse and tied his bound hands to the saddle horn. Through it all, Ethan kept his eyes on Meen, that same intensity she'd seen the first day they met. "Take care of the ranch," he told her. "There's money in the lockbox in my room if you need it. Combination's your birthday, the one you told me, from the Chinese calendar." She'd mentioned it once, weeks ago, in passing conversation. He'd remembered. "I'll take care of it," she said, "and I'll be here when you come back." "If I come back?" "When," she insisted. "Not if." The marshal mounted his horse. "Let's move. We've got a long ride to the territorial courthouse." They rode out, taking Ethan with them. Meen stood in the yard and watched until they were just dust on the horizon, her hand closed tight around the marshal's badge. Then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table, the bread dough forgotten, and made a plan. Because Ethan might believe he was going to die in federal custody, but Meen hadn't crossed an ocean and survived poverty and fire and prejudice just to lose the first person who'd treated her like she mattered. She started with the lockbox. Found it in Ethan's room exactly where he'd said, hidden under a loose floorboard. The combination was her birthday, the 15th day of the 8th moon, which translated to August 15th by the Western calendar. Inside was more money than she'd expected, nearly $300 in bills and coin, along with documents, property deeds, bank statements, and letters. The letters were old, yellowed with age, written in a careful hand. Meen read them by lamplight, piecing together Ethan's past from fragments of someone else's words, They were from his mother, written when he was young and she was dying. Instructions on how to be a good man, advice on kindness and strength, and the importance of controlling one's temper. "The world will judge you harshly, my son," one letter read. "They will see your father's anger in you and assume the worst. But you are not your father. You are capable of great gentleness if you allow yourself to be. Never forget that strength without control is just violence waiting to happen." Meen set the letters aside carefully and turned to the other documents. Bank statements showing regular deposits. Ethan had been selling cattle, managing the ranch well despite his isolation. Property deeds confirming he owned North Ridge free and clear, 300 acres of good grazing land. And at the bottom of the box, a small daguerreotype photograph. It showed a young woman with kind eyes and dark hair, holding a boy of maybe 8 or 9. The boy had Ethan's features, but without the hardness, without the fear. He was smiling. Meen traced the image with her finger, seeing the man Ethan might have been if Devil's Creek had never happened. Then she tucked everything back into the lockbox except the money and the marshal's badge. She had work to do. The next morning, Meen rode into town on Ethan's gentlest horse, the one he'd taught her to ride on. She wore her best dress and carried herself with the dignity her mother had taught her. Spine straight, chin up, eyes forward. Let them stare, let them judge. She had bigger concerns than their opinions. Her first stop was the general store. The clerk looked up when she entered, his expression shifting from surprise to poorly concealed discomfort. "Mrs. Crowe," he said carefully. "Heard about your husband. Terrible business." "Is it?" Meen set a list on the counter. "I need these supplies. I can pay cash." He glanced at the list. Basic necessities, nothing unusual, then nodded. "I can get these together for you. Might take a few minutes." "I'll wait." While he gathered items, other customers came and went, their conversations dying when they noticed Meen. She heard the whispers anyway. Poor thing. Married a monster. Wonder if she knew. Wonder if he heard her. She ignored them all, her focus on the counter, on the supplies she needed. When the clerk returned with her order, she paid and added an extra $1. "I need information." He pocketed the money. "What kind?" "The marshal who took my husband." "Where's he taking him?" "Territorial courthouse in Abilene, 3 days' ride north." "And the man who testified against Ethan, Silas Cord, where is he?" The clerk hesitated. "That's dangerous information, ma'am." Meen added another $1 to the pile. "Where is he?" "Last I heard, he's in Abilene too, waiting to testify at the trial." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "But ma'am, if you're thinking of going up there, I'm thinking of saving my husband's life, that's all." She gathered her supplies. "Thank you for your help." Her next stop was the saloon, the same establishment where she'd asked for directions to North Ridge on her first day in town. The woman behind the bar, Rose, Meen had learned her name was, looked up when she entered. "Honey, you lost?" "No, I need to talk to someone who knows the law. Someone who isn't afraid of federal marshals or convenient testimony." Rose studied her for a long moment, then nodded toward a table in the corner where a man sat alone, writing in a leather journal. "That's Henry Blake. He's a lawyer, used to work for the territorial government before he had a disagreement with some corrupt judges. He might help you, might not." Meen approached the table. The lawyer was a thin man in his 40s, with ink-stained fingers and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He looked up when her shadow fell across his page. "Mr. Blake?" "That's me." "And you are?" "Meen Crowe. My husband was arrested 3 days ago on charges relating to events at Devil's Creek Camp in 1867. I need someone who can help me prove he's innocent." Blake set down his pen. "Devil's Creek. I remember that case. It was declared a training accident at the time. Whole camp burned down. Everyone dead except 2 survivors. The government buried it deep. One of those survivors is now testifying against my husband. The other is my husband." "And you think there's something wrong with the testimony?" "I think the man testifying, Silas Cord, was there doing the same things Ethan was. I think he's being offered something in exchange for his testimony. And I think my husband is being set up to take the fall for something bigger than anyone's admitting." Blake leaned back in his chair, studying her. "That's a serious accusation. You have any proof? Not yet. But I have money, and I have motivation, and I'm asking you, will you help me? Why should I? Your husband's accused of killing 32 men. That's not exactly sympathetic. Because it wasn't murder. It was an accident caused by experiments the government sanctioned and then tried to cover up. Because the real criminals are the ones who did those experiments, and they're letting my husband die to protect their own secrets. Meen pulled out the marshal's badge and set it on the table. And because I'm not giving up on him, with or without your help. But I'd rather have a lawyer who knows how the system works than try to navigate it alone. Blake picked up the badge, turned it over in his hands, then smiled, a sharp, bitter expression. You took this off Marshal Graves? He gave it to me as insurance for my husband's safe return. Bold move. Graves is not a man who likes being challenged. Blake pocketed the badge. All right, Mrs. Crowe, I'll help you. Not because I think we can win. The deck's stacked pretty heavily against your husband. But because I don't like governments that experiment on their own citizens and then blame the victims when it goes wrong. Relief flooded through Meen. Thank you. What do we do first? First, we ride to Abilene and attend the trial. Second, we find out exactly what Cord's being offered for his testimony. Third, we pray we can find something that contradicts his story before they hang your husband. How long until the trial? Graves will want to move fast. He'll push for a trial date within the week before anyone can mount a real defense. We need to leave tomorrow if we want to get there in time. Meen nodded. I'll be ready. She returned to North Ridge as the sun was setting, her mind full of plans and possibilities. The ranch felt empty without Ethan. Too quiet, too still. She fed the animals and checked the fences, doing the work he'd taught her, keeping his land alive while he was gone. That night, she sat at the kitchen table with the letters from his mother and read them again, looking for something she could use. Some insight into the man Ethan had been before Devil's Creek, something that could show a jury he wasn't a monster. You are capable of great gentleness, his mother had written. Never forget that. Meen folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her bag. Tomorrow she would ride to Abilene with Henry Blake. Tomorrow she would walk into a federal courthouse and fight for a man everyone else had already condemned. But tonight, she allowed herself a moment of fear. Fear that she'd fail. Fear that Ethan would die believing he deserved it. Fear that she'd lose the first person who'd looked at her and seen someone worth keeping. Then she locked that fear away and went to bed. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. The ride to Abilene took 4 days. Blake proved to be good company, sharp-witted and cynical, with a dark sense of humor that helped pass the long hours in the saddle. He told her about his time working for the territorial government, the corruption he'd witnessed, the judges who took bribes, and the marshals who looked the other way. The law's supposed to protect people, he said on the third day, but it only protects the ones with money and power. The rest of us just get ground up in the machinery. Then why do you still practice law? Because every once in a while you get a case like this. A chance to throw sand in the gears, slow the machinery down, maybe save someone who deserves it. He glanced at her. Your husband deserves it, right? He's not actually a mass murderer who deserves to hang. He's a man who was used and discarded by people with power, and he spent 8 years trying to control something he never asked for. Meen met Blake's eyes. Yes, he deserves to be saved. Deserves to be. They reached Abilene on a hot afternoon, the streets crowded with people drawn by news of the trial. The courthouse was a 2-story brick building in the center of town, and a crowd had already gathered outside. Some curious, some angry, all eager for spectacle. Blake secured them rooms at a boarding house, then went to file the necessary paperwork declaring himself as Ethan's legal counsel. Meen waited in her room, listening to the sounds of the town outside, the conversations about the monster who would finally face justice. That evening, Blake returned with news. Trial starts tomorrow morning. Judge Harlan presiding. He's fair, which is good, but he's also a stickler for procedure. We'll need solid evidence to counter Cord's testimony, not just emotional appeals. What kind of evidence? Ideally, someone else who was there. Someone who can confirm that what happened at Devil's Creek was an accident caused by the experiments, not premeditated murder. Blake sat down heavily. But everyone else is dead, which means we need to prove Cord is lying, or at least has motivation to lie. Can we subpoena records from the military? From whoever was running those experiments? Already tried. Those records are classified. The government's not about to admit they were conducting illegal experiments on civilians. He rubbed his face tiredly. We're fighting blind, Meen, but we'll do what we can. The next morning, Meen dressed carefully in her best clothes and followed Blake to the courthouse. The crowd had grown overnight, people pressing close to see the accused monster. Inside, the courtroom was packed, every seat filled, spectators lining the walls. And in the front, flanked by 2 armed guards, sat Ethan. He looked thinner than when she'd last seen him, his face drawn and pale. They'd removed his gloves, and she could see the silver marks on his hands clearly, visible evidence of the power everyone feared. When he turned and saw her, something shifted in his expression. Surprise, then something softer. Hope, maybe. The judge entered, and everyone rose. Judge Harlan was a gray-haired man with a stern face and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He settled into his seat and banged his gavel. This court is now in session. We're here for the matter of the United States versus Ethan Crowe, charged with 32 counts of murder in connection with the Devil's Creek incident of 1867. How does the defendant plead? Blake stood. Not guilty, Your Honor, and I'd like to request a continuance to allow time for proper preparation of the defense. Request denied. This case has been pending long enough. We'll proceed. Harlan looked to the prosecution. Call your first witness. The prosecutor, a sharp-faced man named Dalton, smiled. The prosecution calls Silas Cord. The man who entered the courtroom was tall and hard-looking, with a scar running from his eye to his jaw. He walked with confidence, took the oath without hesitation, and sat in the witness chair like he owned it. Dalton approached him. Mr. Cord, were you present at Devil's Creek Camp on the night of August 12, 1867? I was. And what happened that night? Ethan Crowe killed everyone there. Cord's voice was steady, practiced. Burned them alive while they slept. I barely escaped with my life. Why would he do such a thing? Because he was angry. They'd been training us, teaching us to control the power they'd given us, and Crowe couldn't handle it. He lost his temper and murdered 32 innocent men. It was a lie. Meen could see it in the way Cord held himself. Too confident, too smooth. She could see it in the way Ethan flinched at the words, but she couldn't prove it. Not yet. Blake stood for cross-examination. Mr. Cord, you said the men at Devil's Creek were training you to do what exactly? To be soldiers. Elite soldiers who could handle difficult missions. And this training involved giving you, what did you call it, power? Cord hesitated. Enhanced abilities. What kind of enhanced abilities? Objection, Dalton said quickly. Relevance? Your Honor, if the government was conducting illegal experiments, sustained, Harlan frowned. Mr. Blake, stick to the events of the night in question. Blake changed tactics. Mr. Cord, what were you offered in exchange for your testimony? Nothing. I'm here because it's the right thing to do. Really? No immunity deal? No payment? No promises of protection? I don't need protection. I need justice. Justice for 32 men who were participating in the same illegal experiments you were? Blake leaned forward. Or justice that keeps you from being charged as an accessory? Objection! Dalton was on his feet. Your Honor, the defense is harassing the witness. I'm establishing motivation for false testimony, Blake countered. Harlan considered. I'll allow it, but tread carefully, Mr. Blake. Blake turned back to Cord. Tell me, Mr. Cord, where were you when the camp caught fire? I was in my bunk. I woke up to screaming and smoke. And you just happened to escape while everyone else died? I was lucky. Lucky, Blake repeated, or complicit. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Dalton objected again, and Harlan called for order, but the seed was planted. Meen could see it in the jury's faces. Doubt, just a sliver, but there. It wasn't enough. But it was a start. The trial stretched into its second day with Blake chipping away at Cord's testimony piece by piece, finding small inconsistencies, questioning convenient details. But without hard evidence, without another witness, it was just theory against testimony. And the jury looked more convinced by Cord's confident answers than Blake's pointed questions. Meen sat in the gallery, watching Ethan's face as the prosecution painted him as a monster. He didn't defend himself, didn't protest the characterizations. He just sat there with his marked hands visible to everyone, looking like a man who'd already accepted his fate. That was what finally broke through her carefully maintained composure. Not the lies, not the fear, but Ethan's resignation. The way he'd given up on himself before the fight even finished. During the lunch recess, Blake managed to get her 5 minutes with Ethan in a holding room, the guards watching from outside the door. "You can't give up," Meen said the moment they were alone. "I can see it in your face. You think you deserve this." "I killed those men, Meen. Maybe not the way Cord says, maybe not on purpose, but they're still dead because of me." Ethan looked at his marked hands. Maybe this is just justice catching up. Justice would be holding accountable everyone who participated in those experiments. The men who gave you that power, who didn't teach you to control it, who created the situation that led to those deaths. She moved closer, lowering her voice. Justice is not you dying for someone else's crimes. Even if Blake proves Cord is lying, even if we show the experiments were illegal, I'm still the one who burned that camp. That's not something a jury can ignore. Then we make them understand why it happened. Meen pulled out the letter from his mother, the one about gentleness and control. We show them who you were before, who you've tried to be since. We prove that 8 years of isolation and discipline mean something. Ethan read the letter, his jaw tightening. My mother would be ashamed of what I became. Your mother would be proud of what you survived, of the man you've worked to be despite everything stacked against you. Meen took his marked hand in hers, ignoring the guard's warning shout. The silver lines flared bright for just a moment, then steadied. You told me the power responds to emotion, so give it something to respond to, not fear, not resignation, but the reason you've fought so hard to control it all these years. What reason is that? Because you're better than what they made you. Because you deserve a life beyond just surviving. She squeezed his hand. Because I'm not ready to lose you. The guard yanked her back before Ethan could respond, and the moment was over. But as they led him back to the courtroom, Meen saw something shift in his posture, a straightening of his spine, a lifting of his head. He wasn't giving up anymore. That afternoon, Blake called his first witness, Meen herself. She took the stand, feeling every eye in the courtroom on her, the whispers following her like smoke. "Mrs. Crowe," Blake began, "how long have you been married to the defendant?" 6 weeks. "And in those 6 weeks, has your husband ever harmed you or threatened you in any way?" "No, never." "Has he shown you the power he possesses?" "Yes." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Blake waited for it to settle. "And when he showed you this power, what happened?" "Nothing. He was afraid of hurting me, but he didn't. He spent 8 years learning to control it, learning to live with something he never asked for." Meen looked directly at the jury. "My husband is not a monster. He's a man who was used by people with power and then abandoned when the experiment went wrong. He's been punishing himself for 8 years for an accident he couldn't prevent. That's not murder. That's tragedy." Dalton stood for a cross-examination, his expression sharp. "Mrs. Crowe, you're from China, correct?" "Yes. And you came to America seeking, what, opportunity? Wealth?" "I came seeking survival. My family was dead. I had nowhere else to go." "So when you saw an advertisement for a wife from a wealthy rancher, that must have seemed like quite an opportunity." Blake objected. "Relevance, Your Honor?" "I'm establishing motivation for the witness's testimony," Dalton said smoothly. "If Mrs. Crowe married for financial security, her testimony defending her husband is hardly unbiased." Harlan nodded. "I'll allow it. Answer the question, Mrs. Crowe." Meen met Dalton's eyes steadily. "I married my husband because I needed shelter and food. That's true. But I stayed because he's a good man trapped in impossible circumstances. I'm testifying because I've seen who he is when nobody's watching. I've seen him work himself to exhaustion rather than risk hurting someone. I've seen him isolate himself for years to protect people who fear him. That's not a murderer. That's someone with more honor than most people in this courtroom." "Or it's a woman protecting her meal ticket," Dalton said. "Then you don't understand what honor means," Meen replied calmly. "And you don't understand my husband at all." She was dismissed, But the damage was done. Dalton had planted the seed that she was biased, self-interested, not to be trusted. Blake tried to recover with character witnesses. The general store clerk who admitted Ethan always paid his bills on time. The neighbor Garrett, who reluctantly testified that Ethan had never actually threatened anyone despite his reputation. But it wasn't enough to counter Cord's vivid description of deliberate murder. By the end of the second day, the prosecution rested its case, and Blake had nothing left but desperate hope. That night, Meen couldn't sleep. She paced her boarding house room, turning over every piece of information they had, looking for something they'd missed. Blake had gone through the legal documents, searching for procedural errors. But legal technicalities wouldn't save Ethan. They needed proof that Cord was lying. Around midnight, she heard shouting in the street below. Meen went to the window and saw a commotion outside the saloon, men arguing, one of them being held back by his friends. And in the lamplight, she recognized one of the men. He'd been in the courtroom, sitting in the back, watching everything with cold calculation. Something about him triggered a memory. Something Cord had said during his testimony about barely escaping the fire, about being in his bunk when it started. Meen grabbed her shawl and ran downstairs, catching Blake just as he returned from the courthouse. "I need you to request the military records again," she said. "Not the experiment files, those are sealed, but personnel records, roster information. Who was stationed at Devil's Creek the night it burned?" "We already know who was there," Cord testified. "Cord said he was in his bunk, that he woke up to screaming and smoke. But what if he's lying about where he was?" Meen grabbed Blake's arm. "What if he wasn't in the camp when it burned? What if he was somewhere else and that's how he survived?" Blake's eyes sharpened. "You think he set it up? That he knew what was going to happen and got clear before it did? Or he caused it and blamed Ethan?" Meen's mind was racing now. Ethan said the power surged during a ritual. What if someone sabotaged that ritual? What if Cord wanted those men dead and used Ethan as the weapon? That's a hell of a theory. Can you prove it? Not without records showing where Cord was that night. Can you get them? Blake considered. Personnel rosters might not be classified the same way experiment records are. I can file an emergency motion, argue it's material to the defense. Harlan might allow it. Then file it, tonight. We're running out of time. Blake worked through the night, and by morning he had the motion ready. Judge Harlan wasn't happy about the last-minute request, but he was fair enough to hear the argument. "Your Honor," Blake said, "the defense has reason to believe the prosecution's key witness may have been complicit in the very crime he's testifying about. Personnel records from Devil's Creek camp would show where Silas Cord was stationed the night of the fire. If those records contradict his testimony, it's material evidence that could prove my client's innocence." Dalton shot to his feet. "This is a fishing expedition, Your Honor. The defense has no evidence to support these wild accusations." "The prosecution's entire case rests on Cord's testimony," Blake countered. "If we can prove he's lying about his whereabouts that night, it undermines everything he's said. The jury deserves to know the truth." Harlan drummed his fingers on the bench. "I'll allow it. But Mr. Blake, you have 24 hours to produce these records, or we move to closing arguments. Understood?" "Understood, Your Honor." Blake sent telegrams immediately, calling in every favor he had with the military records office in Washington. Meen spent the day in the courthouse library, reading through old newspaper accounts of Devil's Creek, looking for any detail that might help. The official story was sparse. A training accident, all personnel lost, investigation closed. But between the lines, she found hints of something darker. Questions raised by journalists about the nature of the training, concerns about civilian oversight. All of it buried under classified stamps and official denials. By evening, Blake had received a response to his telegrams. He found Meen in the library, his expression grim. "The records are being sent, but they won't arrive in time for tomorrow's deadline. The best they can do is 3 days. Then we ask for an extension." "Harlan won't grant it. He wants this trial over." Blake sat down heavily. "I'm sorry, Meen. I think we're out of options." But Meen wasn't ready to accept defeat. She went to the courthouse that evening after everyone had left, slipping past the night guard with a story about leaving her shawl in the gallery. Inside the empty courtroom, she sat in the witness chair and tried to think like Cord. Tried to understand what would make a man betray his fellow soldiers. What would make him survive when everyone else died? And then she remembered the man outside the saloon, the one who'd been watching the trial so carefully. She found him the next morning at a boarding house on the edge of town. He was older than she'd thought, maybe 60, with the weathered look of a career soldier. When she knocked on his door, he opened it warily. "You were at the trial," Meen said, "watching Silas Cord testify. Why?" "That's none of your business. My husband is going to hang because of Cord's testimony. If you know something that can help, I'm begging you to share it." The man studied her for a long moment, then stepped back. "Come in, but I'm not promising anything." Inside the small room, he poured them both coffee and sat down across from her. "My name's Walter Price. I was a captain in the cavalry, stationed near Devil's Creek back in '67. I wasn't part of the experiments, but I knew what was happening there." "What was happening?" "Government was trying to create super soldiers, men who could kill without conventional weapons. They recruited volunteers at first, then when that didn't work, they started using prisoners, men who didn't have a choice." Price's hands shook slightly around his coffee cup. "Silas Cord was one of the overseers. He wasn't a subject like your husband. He was one of the men running the experiments." Meen's heart raced. "Can you testify to that?" "I already tried. Filed a report after Devil's Creek burned, tried to get a real investigation going. The government buried it. Threatened my career, my pension, everything. I learned to keep my mouth shut. But you're here now, watching the trial." "Because I knew this day would come, knew they'd need a scapegoat for what they did." He set down his cup. "Your husband was 16 years old when they brought him to that camp. Just a kid who'd gotten in trouble with the law, and they offered him a deal: participate in the experiments or go to prison. He didn't know what he was agreeing to." "Then why is Cord testifying against him?" "Because Cord was the one who sabotaged the final ritual. I have a witness who saw him tampering with the equipment the night before the fire. He wanted to destroy the evidence of what they'd been doing, and he used your husband's power to do it." Price stood and pulled a folder from his bag. "These are copies of the reports I filed. Documentation of Cord's role in the experiments. Witness statements. Everything the government tried to bury." Meen took the folder with trembling hands. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" "Because I'm a coward who values his pension more than justice. But I can't watch an innocent man hang for something Cord orchestrated." He met her eyes. "Take those documents to your lawyer. Make them count." Meen ran back to the courthouse, finding Blake just as court was about to resume. She shoved the folder into his hands and told him everything Price had said. Blake flipped through the documents, his eyes widening. "This is it. This is what we need." He looked up at Harlan's bench. "But I don't know if the judge will allow it. These reports were never officially filed in this case." "Then make him allow it," Meen said. "Please." Court resumed, and Blake immediately stood. "Your Honor, the defense has obtained new evidence material to this case. I request permission to call a new witness and introduce documents that prove the prosecution's key witness has perjured himself." Dalton objected furiously, but Harlan silenced him. "Approach the bench, both of you." Blake brought the documents forward, and for 10 tense minutes the judge read through them while the courtroom buzzed with speculation. Finally, Harlan looked up. "I'm going to allow this. But Mr. Blake, if you're wasting this court's time—" "I'm not, Your Honor. I'm saving an innocent man's life." Walter Price took the stand looking like a man who'd made peace with the consequences of his choice. He stated his name and rank for the record, then confirmed everything he'd told Meen. "Captain Price," Blake said, "you were stationed near Devil's Creek in 1867. What was the nature of the experiments being conducted there?" "They were trying to bond supernatural energy to human subjects, create weapons out of men. It was illegal, immoral, and doomed to fail." "And what was Silas Cord's role in these experiments?" "He was an overseer. One of the men who administered the treatments, supervised the rituals, ensured the subjects complied. He wasn't a victim. He was one of the perpetrators." The courtroom erupted. Harlan banged his gavel for order while Dalton stood shouting objections. Cord himself had gone pale, his confident demeanor cracking. Blake pressed forward. "Did you witness Cord tampering with the equipment used in the final ritual?" "I didn't personally witness it, but I have testimony from a technician who did. The night before the ritual that killed 32 men, Cord was seen adjusting the containment field. The technician reported it to his superior, but nothing was done." "And where's this technician now?" "Dead. Committed suicide 2 years after Devil's Creek. But his written statement is in the documents I've provided. Blake turned to the jury. So, to be clear, Silas Cord wasn't a fellow victim who barely escaped. He was one of the men responsible for creating the situation that led to those deaths. He sabotaged the ritual, likely knowing it would cause a catastrophic release of energy, and then blamed my client for the results. Objection! Dalton was on his feet. This is all speculation based on the hearsay testimony of a dead witness. It's documented evidence that directly contradicts Mr. Cord's sworn testimony, Blake shot back, and it raises serious questions about his credibility. Harlan called for a recess while he reviewed the evidence. An hour later, court resumed with a grim-faced judge. I've reviewed Captain Price's testimony and the supporting documents. While much of this is circumstantial, it does raise sufficient doubt about Mr. Cord's credibility to warrant further examination. He looked at Dalton. The prosecution will recall Silas Cord for cross-examination by the defense. Cord took the stand again, but his confidence was gone. Blake approached him like a predator who'd scented blood. Mr. Cord, you testified that you were a fellow subject in the Devil's Creek experiments. Is that correct? Yes. But you were actually an overseer, weren't you? One of the men running those experiments? No, Captain Price has testified under oath that you were an overseer. Are you saying a decorated military officer is lying? Cord's jaw worked. Price doesn't know what he's talking about. He wasn't even part of the program. But he was stationed nearby. He filed official reports documenting your role, reports that were buried by the government to avoid embarrassment. Blake pulled out one of the documents. This report, dated August 10th, 1867, specifically names you as one of 3 overseers responsible for the ritual containment protocols. Care to explain that? Those reports are classified. You shouldn't even have them. That's not an answer. Were you or were you not an overseer at Devil's Creek? Cord looked to Dalton for help, but the prosecutor sat frozen. Finally, Cord said, I was involved in supervision, yes, but I was also a subject. I received the same treatments as Crowe. According to the medical records Captain Price provided, you never underwent the bonding ritual. You were never marked with the power. You were pure staff, not a test subject. Blake leaned closer. You lied about being a fellow victim. What else did you lie about? I didn't lie. Did you or did you not tamper with the containment field the night before the ritual? No! We have a sworn statement from a technician who saw you doing exactly that. A technician who reported it and was ignored. A technician who later killed himself, presumably out of guilt for not doing more to prevent what happened. Cord was sweating now, his composure completely shattered. That technician was unreliable. Everyone knew he had problems. Problems that led him to falsely accuse a superior officer, or problems that developed after he witnessed a cover-up. Blake pulled out another document. You were offered full immunity for your testimony against Ethan Crowe. What exactly were you being given immunity from, if you were just an innocent victim? The silence that followed was damning. Cord opened his mouth, closed it, looked around the courtroom like he was searching for an escape route. I want to invoke my right against self-incrimination, he finally said. The courtroom exploded. Harlan banged his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. When the noise finally died down, he looked at Cord with cold fury. Mr. Cord, you do understand that invoking that right in the middle of testimony severely undermines the credibility of everything you've said? I understand, Your Honor, but I'm not answering any more questions. Harlan turned to Dalton. Does the prosecution have any other witnesses? Dalton looked like he wanted to disappear. No, Your Honor. Our case rested on Mr. Cord's testimony. Then, given the serious credibility issues that have emerged, I'm declaring a mistrial. Harlan banged his gavel. Mr. Crowe, you're free to go. And Mr. Dalton, I suggest you speak to your superiors about who they allow to testify in federal court. This has been a waste of everyone's time. The courtroom erupted again, but Meen didn't hear it. She pushed through the crowd toward Ethan, who stood slowly, looking dazed. The guards had already removed his shackles, and when she reached him, she threw her arms around him without thinking. He caught her, his marked hand steadying her, and for the first time in the 6 weeks she'd known him, he held her back. Really held her, like she was something precious instead of something dangerous. You saved me, he said against her hair. I don't know how, but you saved me. We saved each other, Meen replied. Now, let's go home. The ride back to North Ridge took 5 days, but it felt like a different journey than the one that had brought them to Abilene. Ethan talked more, sharing stories from his childhood, asking about her life in China. The walls he'd built were still there, but they had doors now. Windows. Blake rode with them for the first 2 days that then split off to head back to his practice. Before he left, he pulled Meen aside. "You did good work back there. Better than most lawyers I know." He handed her a card. "If you ever need legal help again, you know where to find me. No charge." "Thank you for believing us," Meen said. "Thank you for reminding me why I became a lawyer in the first place." He tipped his hat and rode off. When they finally reached North Ridge, the ranch looked exactly as Meen had left it. Fences mended, animals fed, everything maintained. She'd done what Ethan had asked, kept his land alive while he was gone. That night, they sat on the porch together, watching the sun set over the western pastures. Ethan still wore his gloves, but they sat close enough that their shoulders touched. "What happens now?" Meen asked. "I don't know. The trial's over, but people's minds won't change overnight. The town will still fear me." "Let them. We don't need the town." She turned to face him. "But we do need to figure out what this is. This marriage, this life we're building." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled off one glove, slowly, and held out his marked hand to her. "I'm not good at this. At letting people in. At trusting that I won't hurt the people I care about." "I know." Meen took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. The silver marks glowed faintly, then steadied. "But you're learning." "We both are." "I care about you," he said quietly. "More than I thought I could care about anyone. You're not just my wife on paper anymore. You're your partner," Meen finished. "Your friend, your anchor when the storms come." "Yeah." He squeezed her hand gently. "All of that." They sat in comfortable silence as night fell, and Meen thought about how far they'd both come. From strangers making a desperate bargain to partners who'd fought for each other's lives. It wasn't a traditional love story, but then again, nothing about their lives was traditional. Over the following months, they built something neither of them had expected. A real marriage, not just a legal arrangement. Ethan slowly learned to trust himself around her, to remove his gloves during meals, to accept her touch without fearing what might happen. Meen learned the rhythms of the ranch, becoming not just a housekeeper, but a true partner in managing the land. And the power that had defined Ethan's life for so long began to change. With Meen's grounding presence, he learned to channel it instead of just containing it. He could heat water for bathing without burning it, could start fires for cooking without losing control, could even use it to help with the hardest ranch work like branding cattle or clearing brush. The town noticed. Slowly, cautiously, people began to see Ethan differently. Not as the monster they'd feared, but as a man who'd survived impossible circumstances and come out stronger. Thomas Garrett started visiting occasionally, bringing news and eventually asking for help with his own ranch work. The general store clerk stopped overcharging. The preacher nodded to them on the street. It wasn't acceptance, exactly, but it was a beginning. 2 years after the trial, Meen discovered she was pregnant. The news terrified Ethan. He was convinced the child would inherit his marks, his curse, his burden. But when their daughter was born, healthy and whole, with only the faintest trace of silver in her eyes, his fear transformed into fierce protective love. They named her Grace, after Ethan's mother. And as she grew, they realized she did carry a gift. Not the destructive power Ethan had received, but something gentler. She could heal small wounds with a touch, could soothe frightened animals, could sense emotions and calm troubled hearts. "She got the best of both of us," Meen said one evening, watching Grace play in the yard. "Your strength and my stubbornness." "And your courage," Ethan added. "She's not afraid of anything. She learned that from watching you face down your fears every day and choose to keep going anyway." 5 years after that, word came that the government program responsible for Devil's Creek had been fully exposed. Captain Price had continued gathering evidence after the trial, building a case that finally couldn't be ignored. The men who'd run those experiments were arrested. The victims, the ones who'd survived, were offered compensation and medical care. Ethan received a letter offering him settlement money and a formal apology from the government. He read it once, then burned it in the kitchen stove. "Don't you want the money?" Meen asked. I don't want anything from them. We've built this life without their help. We don't need it now. But he kept the apology letter from the Secretary of War. Sometimes late at night, Meen would catch him reading it, not because he needed their validation, but because it represented something important. Acknowledgement that what had been done to him was wrong, that he'd been a victim, not a villain. Their ranch became known for something unexpected, as a haven for people with nowhere else to go. Others who'd been marked by the experiments began finding their way to North Ridge, drawn by stories of the man who'd learned to control his power and the woman who'd stood by him. Ethan and Meen gave them work, taught them control, offered them the understanding and patience no one else would. The town grumbled at first, but they couldn't argue with results. The marked people who came to North Ridge didn't cause trouble. They worked hard, kept to themselves, and slowly proved that the power they carried didn't have to be destructive. 10 years after Meen first stepped off that stagecoach with nothing but desperation and courage, North Ridge Ranch had transformed from a place of isolation into a community. Not large, maybe 15 people at any given time, but real. A family built not from blood, but from shared understanding and mutual respect. Grace grew into a strong, compassionate young woman who moved between the marked and unmarked worlds with ease. She became a bridge, translating her father's experiences for people who'd never had to fear their own hands, advocating for others who carried gifts they hadn't asked for. Meen never forgot the Chinese woman she'd been, the desperate immigrant with no options and no hope. But she'd become something more, the heart of a community, the strength behind a man who'd nearly destroyed himself with fear, the mother of a daughter who would change the world's understanding of what it meant to be different. And Ethan, the cowboy nobody had dared to touch, the monster everyone feared, became the gentlest father, the most patient teacher, the living proof that redemption was possible even after the worst had happened. On their 10th anniversary, they sat on that same porch where they'd shared so many quiet evenings. Grace was inside teaching a new arrival how to control his power through breathing exercises. The ranch hands were settling the animals for the night. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed contentedly. Do you ever regret it? Ethan asked. Answering that advertisement? Coming here? Meen took his hand, bare now, the gloves long since abandoned except in coldest winter. I regret nothing. This life, this family, this purpose, it's more than I ever dreamed of having. Even though it's been hard, even though people still judge us, especially because of that, because we proved them wrong, because we showed that love and patience can transform even the darkest circumstances into something worth having. She leaned against his shoulder. You gave me a home, Ethan. I gave you hope. That's a fair trade. He kissed the top of her head, a gesture that had become natural over the years. More than fair. It's a miracle. As the sun set over North Ridge Ranch, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Meen thought about the long journey that had brought her here. From a village in Guangdong to a dusty Texas ranch, from desperate isolation to hard-won belonging, from a marriage of convenience to a love that had weathered impossible storms. The Chinese woman the town had underestimated had become the reason a feared man found redemption. The rancher nobody dared approach had become a haven for the unwanted and the different. And together, they'd built something neither could have created alone. A future where the marks that once meant only destruction had become symbols of survival, strength, and the transformative power of someone believing you're worth saving. Their daughter's laughter drifted out from the house, mixed with the gentle voice of the newest arrival learning to trust himself again. The cattle settled into their evening quiet. A cool breeze carried the scent of sage and wildflowers across the land they'd fought so hard to keep. And in that moment, Meen understood that this was what home truly meant. Not a place you were born, but a place you chose. Not a life handed to you, but a life you built with your own hands alongside someone brave enough to build it with you. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of someone who made the struggle worthwhile. Ethan's hand tightened around hers, and she knew he felt it too. This peace they'd created, this family they'd built, this legacy they were leaving, not of fear and isolation, but of courage and community and the radical act of choosing to believe that people could change, that circumstances didn't have to define destiny, and that sometimes the most dangerous choice was also the one that led to the most beautiful transformation. The stars began appearing in the darkening sky, and they sat together in the gathering twilight. Two people who'd found each other when they'd both given up on being found. Two outcasts who'd created belonging. Two survivors who'd built something worth surviving for. And in the years to come, when people told stories about Northridge Ranch and the marked people who found sanctuary there, they would speak of the rancher who'd learned to master impossible power and the immigrant woman who'd taught him it was safe to be touched. They would speak of the community that grew from nothing, the lives that were saved, the understanding that was built one careful conversation at a time. But for Meen and Ethan, the story was simpler than that. It was the story of two people who'd been alone for too long, who'd made a desperate bargain, and who'd discovered that sometimes the best things in life came from the bravest risks. It was the story of choosing to stay when leaving would have been easier, of choosing to trust when fear seemed more reasonable, of choosing to build a future even when the past tried to destroy it. It was, in the end, the story of home, and it was theirs.